What's up, y'all?
Hey y'all.
Or hey, us.
Hey us. Yeah, I don't see any. Oh, there's 8 people. Hey, Lena, how's it going? Oh my
Oh, man. I was about
God.
to say live my best life, but that would not be true. So,
I think you're living a better version of your life than you've been living
that,
recently.
that's true.
Yeah. No, that's all you can ask for. Best is good, but better is best. Hey, Lead Clinton. Hey, Alex. Hey, Snowman. Hey, Librarian. Librarian, you about to leave? You know the drill. You on the desk? Or is it spring break or something?
Phew. Shit,
Hey, Tidamacha. And thank you, Tidamacha, for doing the
Oh yeah, the notes, the
no,
reading notes.
really, really appreciate that and doing the reading list. Did we end up putting that in the folder?
We need to. I don't think so.
We know librarian. Now we know your schedule, man. Librarian, what I want to know what library you work at, but I guess that might be a little bit like doxing. I don't
Yeah,
know. Sometimes I want to pull up and say what's good. Hey, Ashy Knuckles.
your favorite name,
My favorite name. What is it? Gungy Park? I don't know what that means.
Gungi Park.
Or maybe, yeah, maybe. Okay, that's like a maybe Korean or something. Um, what's going on, guys? We both just got off spring break. I think I got off the week after you, right? I think
Yeah,
like this past week, and yours was the week before.
yeah. My break was no break at all, but things are done. So.
Things are done. Thanks, Ashy Knuckles. I got it from Dianu. Y'all, any like most of the African print stuff that I have is from Dianu. So yeah, and thanks for tapping in. Hey, what's going on, D?
Not you getting excited like that's your cousin that you ain't seen in years.
No, that's Dartricia's husband.
Uh,
Yeah, Big Dwight. And he I don't know if you saw, but he made me that Claudia Jones. He made me a Claudia Jones picture, and
yeah, we were talking about that when we were in New
yeah,
Orleans.
exactly. And then like the little Maurice Bishop. Oh yeah, because you were saying you were gonna tap
Try to
in.
solicit. Yes.
Tried to commission some art. Hey, Elon.
Yes.
Lizzle.
Yeah, I said I had wanted something that had Arheli Alaya and Hosina Michelle or Mutemba together. And because I particularly wanted the pictures of them with their holding their guns when they were young women.
That would be a good picture. I like the picture, like the Eritrean, like revolutionaries.
Uh-huh.
They say the
Uh-huh.
only time Eritrean women get on their knees is to shoot and pray.
Hey, sounds like a solid philosophy to live by.
I mean, there might be other reasons why, but
Hey, I mean, you can do other things.
sure.
Other things.
I loved your presentation on the People's Forum. Needed that revolutionary optimism. Appreciate it, Alex. It was a good program. That's like a good little crowd there. Yours is what, this week, this Saturday?
No, it's Tuesday. So
Oh, it's Tuesday. You'll find up on
yeah,
a Tuesday.
I fly up on Monday and back on Wednesday.
Yeah, they got you. Well, we'll talk about that offline. The hotel, if it was the same one, it was just okay. But the gym is good. It just smells weird because it's in the basement.
That's
But it's a
that.
pretty good
I
gym.
know that's a big thing for you.
Oh, bro, it was like, but hey Jade Curvo. Okay, you want to just start by reading
Yeah.
the comments. All right,
All right.
y'all. No, life update. Or do we want to start with comments or life updates?
We can mine are quick, so I'll do like updates. I don't, let's see. So 2 weeks ago, so I guess I already mentioned that I submitted the book. I think I had not yet submitted my third year proposal when we had the show. I think the committee actually met today to determine whether or not I have made successful progress to tenure at this point. Who knows? I guess we'll get word back soon. So that's done. Sharice and I also officially finished the 75 medium challenge, which is nice. Although
Yeah.
we both have decided to continue on. So that is feeling good. I think I'm just generally feeling better physically, all those kinds of things.
Did you take
As
your
was art.
after picture?
I did take my picture. I
Can you
did.
tell the difference? Did you like
I
compare
did.
them?
You know what I wish I had done when we first started was actually take my measurements, because I did it like later on, and
Mhm.
I've definitely lost inches. Like that's for sure. Like all the way around, like everything, like neck, stomach, thighs, calf muscles, arm, like everything.
I
Um,
I didn't take my pictures yet. I need to take them. I've been feeling I need to because I haven't woke up early enough. I want to take them at the same time, but I'm gonna take them
uh,
tomorrow.
I didn't take it at the same time, I don't think, but I did have on the same clothes. And I could definitely tell a difference. But even if I didn't take those pictures, I could tell a difference in many
Mhm.
things. So
Yeah.
just basically, I live on a third floor, and y'all, when I was in Germany, I lived on a fifth floor walk up. So even just the what is it? I'm at training about to shut up, Sheree. Why did you make that?
Excuse you, rude Dre. I'm right here. That's why
Hello.
you can't lift more than 15 pounds. I'm just playing. Have a
But
great
what I will say though is that so I don't know, I think y'all know this about me. So I was a competitive swimmer growing up, and there was a woman named Tanya Boone who taught me how to swim. Me and my brother both how to swim, and she was a homeschooler, and she ended up starting this North Carolina Aqua Blazers, a black swim team, when we were growing up. And every year we have, like for the past 20 years, we have this Black Heritage Swim Meet that happens in Raleigh in May. And every year is about 1,000 swimmers black swimmers from all over the country that come. We've had like Olympians and things like that. But since I've been, back on this fitness journey and back in the water, I decided that I wanted to get back into teaching swim lessons. And so I think that's what, so there was a coach that I met. He's here in Boston, but I met back when I was coaching for them. So I actually just reached out to him like 2 or 3 days ago to talk to him about teaching lessons at some of the Black Ys in the Boston area. Because the Y that I swim at is predominantly an Asian community. Cool, happy to teach Asian children, but I would love to use my skills to also teach Black children how to swim. So that's something that I've decided that I want to get back into. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just my last little update is that the party, the AAPRPGC, has our Pan-African Women's Day program coming up on March 30th. I'm going to just drop a link in the chat if folks are interested in it. And we've got folks from all over. We're not doing it as like a typical like panel style presentations. We actually just have a set of questions that we're going to pose to the panelists and try to have it as a more sort of roundtable discussion. But we have folks from the Congo, from Venezuela, from Cuba, from the Palestinian Youth Movement, from Cameroon, from the Free Haiti Movement. So we've got, a good little lineup, and hope to see some of y'all there. It's virtual, so sign
I'll
up.
be sending in a video. I was supposed to be on it, but I'll be on the plane. So
Okay.
I guess a
Yeah.
video. Talking about what I don't Lee didn't send me the questions, so maybe I'll
Oh, he didn't?
No. I'll double check. Okay. My updates are not eventful. I did my People's Forum class. I think it went pretty well. There was like good conversation. It was interesting. When I was walking out, some white man walked in and was like, "Oh my gosh, I just realized you're Dr. CBS, and I didn't realize you were going to be here. I walked in right when you were saying goodbye, and oh my gosh." And he talked to me for like 20 minutes. I guess I tweeted something about settler colonialism one time. But it was really interesting. It was nice to, I feel like only in New York do people like actually does that type of thing happen. It happened once in LA. A long ass time ago. Remember for my birthday? But
Yeah.
but it was nice, so it was great. And people, the same day of my presentation was also like a protest for Mahmoud Khalil. So they were like, there's like in and out. I saw Eugene per year briefly. But anyway, so yeah, it was a good experience. I'm glad that I was included. Tomorrow, there's a Malcolm X symposium that the philosophy graduate students at Michigan State are putting on. I'm doing the keynote address tomorrow. Akinele Umoja is doing the keynote address on Saturday. So that should be a great conference. If you are in the Michigan area, you should pull up. I don't know if it's hybrid or not. So if you can go and person, that'd be great. Then from there, I'm flying on Saturday to the National Council for Black Studies conference that's in Cincinnati. I'm going to be on the closing plenary that's on. Michael Tillotson has this theory called agency reduction formation. A long time ago, I wrote an article about that. So it's going to be myself, Valerie Grimm, Ronald Stevens. I think that's his name. That's not his name. I don't know what his name. I forgot the other dude's name. I've met him, but he's cool. He's a Q. That's what I remember about him. But anyway, we're gonna be doing comments on the sort of development of that theory, and so that should be nice. This will be my first time going back to NCBS since they red baited me in 2019.
Oh God.
I'm just going for that. And then actually a BAP comrade told me that they're going to be presenting on a panel that's right before the plenary. So I'm going to go to that too. And then I have a Black Scare, Red Scare talk at Wayne State next week, which should be fine. And the most important thing, Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney's birthday is on March 23rd. It's very exciting. So, and this is a great year because 38 is the Walter Rodney year. So I'll be turning 38 this year. So I'm really going to try to get my shit together. It's my Walter Rodney year. So anyway, happy birthday, Walter Rodney. Y'all know I love him. I'm a Rodneyist. Love Patricia Rodney. Love the Rodney Foundation. Those are my updates.
My Jesus year was pretty good. That was the year I got divorced or decided to get divorced. So 33 was a good year for me.
That's when you're in South Africa?
The next year. So that year, yes.
Okay.
I will say, so Chidamacha asked, why is Black folks not swimming a trope? We stay in the water when available. I will say my dad decided to put us in swim lessons when we were young because he had started reading all these articles about Black children drowning. So it wasn't even about us swimming competitively or anything like that. He just wanted us to learn how to swim. And he had a terrible experience in his high school where he had some pedophilic coaches who were trying to make the Black kids swim naked, which is actually why he left his school. Yes, which is why he left his school. And so my dad my dad is not afraid of the water, but never learned to swim. But there are real structural reasons why many Black people don't swim because of not having access to it. But there is a good book about by this guy, Kevin Dawson, called Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, which talks about like the history of sort of maritime, the use of enslaved Africans as like lifeguards, basically, which is trying to sort of disrupt all of the kind of narratives about our fears of the water and our inabilities to swim, and to sort of think about them sort of structurally, and why we have obviously been structurally deterred from swimming.
Right. It's like public pools. A lot of Black people don't have pools in their backyard. It is definitely like an access question. So, okay. So do we want to read the comments? Our guest is here, but so yeah, let's go through the comments quickly and then we'll bring Kehinde on. Okay, so first one is from Dana Green 4543, who said, "Thanks for your time. Congrats on the book proposal, Dr. Brown. Looking forward to the next book from you, Dr. CBS. I've seen the guest before and appreciate his insights. Dr. Brown, does the workshop in Knoxville have a public gathering presentation of any sort? And what are the dates in April? I'm interested in what you decide to do with My Country, Africa. I appreciate you both for your erudite contributions. You both are fierce in breaking down difficult concepts with historical clarity, making knowledge ready for us. Brava." Well, thank you.
So I do not know at this point if there is a public component, because I know it is like a workshop kind of format, but it is happening April, I think, 10th and 11th. And then with My Country, My Africa, or My Country, Africa, My Country, I think is the title of the text. I think we were talking about doing it as like a book club. So we haven't decided on the date, but I am like, the first half is more her sort of early biography, and the second half is more about like her work as like a speechwriter under Patrice Lumumba, and her work like under sort of African independence leaders. So we're definitely going to figure out a way to incorporate that into the show. So we just stay tuned for that one.
Mm-hmm.
Gravy Dale says, "Sweetheart lived in Caracas, Mexico City, and Johannesburg. Do the damn thing, sis. That's fly." Those are good times in my life. I'll just say that.
Gravy Dale said, "I'm late than a mug. I have what may seem like an oblique contribution. but it has added to my understanding of this video subject matter. The Walking Quran by Butch Ware has been quite the journey into the concepts of epistemology and pedagogy. It's really challenging me to question if I actually know and have learned anything through its presentation of the standards and conditions of knowing and learning with Senegambian Quran schools. Their standards go well beyond the simple reading, recitation, and memorization models. Amazing text that I recommend.
All right. And Snowman7696 said, great show, ladies. I was just happy Dr. CBS acknowledged me in the chat. See, there you go. There you go, CBS.
Yeah, where's Snow? I saw him earlier too. What up?
Yeah.
Snowman. Now again, I don't know if I asked this last time, but the Snowman sell cocaine? Or is that, are you like Jeezy Snowman, or is this Snowman because it's cold? Don't say that online. Don't answer that. I'm not trying to incriminate you. Okay. My Kyla said, maybe Michaela, said, also glad to have learned more about Dr. Layla. I wish she was in my city. Yeah.
It is that. I mean, because I don't love the city I'm in, so. One Love 4909 said, great show as always. Eve Ewing's new book regarding education, Original Sins, the Miseducation of Black and Native Children, and the Construction of American Racism. Can y'all have her on a future show? Please, thank you. Also look forward to your lectures at TPF. Awesome. Thank you for, we've been telling y'all, if y'all, there are specific people that y'all want to have on to let us know. So thanks for the recommendation.
I know her. I met her one time when I was on a fellowship at University of Chicago, so I can certainly ask her. And then my Kala said, "Ooh, that boy's smart."
And then the last comment comes from Penny Lane 1093. As a social studies educator in a graduate program, this discussion touched on so many of the issues with pedagogy that I'm investigating. The ideological question is one that too many teachers, ed programs don't and can't touch, and was my main frustration as a public school teacher. Thank you for this conversation. It is heartening to know that other educators out there are also working to disrupt the current system of education. Girl, child, we out here trying. That's what I will say.
Yeah, man. Okay, so now we can bring up our guest, Kehinde Andrews. Woo! Hey, Kehinde.
How's it going?
You're all right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. How are you?
Oh, we're doing all right. Living the life. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm a bit tired. I started doing this Black Studies 101 in community. And I just finished. And I got the time. I forgot your clocks went back an hour. So I thought it was an hour later than it is. So
yeah.
So it's good.
Yes. That will catch you off guard, especially when other places do not. I remember when I was living in Germany and I was like, oh, the time changed. Oh.
Okay.
Oh, so just for the record, CBS Snowman said that he does not sell coke.
I saw that. That is, I have thoughts about that, but all right. So let's you want to do the bio that we get out into the interview.
So I will start off and then we'll dig in. All right. Kehinde Andrews is a British academic and public intellectual. He is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. He is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and led the establishment of the first Black Studies program in Europe. He was chair of the Harambe Organization of Black Unity and editor-in-chief of Make It Plain. His latest book, Nobody Can Give You Freedom, The Political Life of Malcolm X, will be published in September 2025, which we'll talk a little bit about today. He also wrote The Psychosis of Whiteness, Surviving the Insanity of a Racist World, The New Age of Empire, How Racism Still Rules the World, Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, and Resisting Racism, Race Inequality in the Black Supplementary School Movement. The Psychosis of Whiteness is described as a rational takedown of the myth that upholds white supremacy and systems and people that promote it across our society. So join us in welcoming Kehinde Andrews, and we are looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for being. I
sent you the bio, but I wouldn't have written half of it in there. So I feel bad.
Bios are always weird, but it's just in the for folks who haven't been introduced to people, I think sometimes it's just helpful to have.
Absolutely. All right, so let's just hop right in. So we're going to start by discussing some of your more recent scholarship, which Layla just mentioned in your bio. So can you talk to us about your book, The Psychosis of Whiteness, Surviving the Insanity of a Racist World, which dropped in 2023? And particularly, can you discuss the relationship between the irrational or crazy aspects of white supremacy and the material interests that undergird it. So like, you know, I always struggle with white supremacy being called like a sickness or a pathology or whatever, because there are material, like it's very rational in some ways, very planned out, rooted in the exploitation and domination of Black folks. So I wonder if you could talk about that. But then relatedly, I'm also interested in your critique of what we might call the anti-racism industrial complex and its overemphasis on individual acts and attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, so I always stress with psychosis, it's actually a structural argument. Like the whole point of the psychosis is in order to live in a world that 9 million people die of hunger a year, we have to have a psychosis. We can't have a rational way of understanding the world, right? So psychosis is the way of dealing with the fact that this whole economy is built on bloodshed, right? Particularly of Black and brown people. So you can have slave owners declaring that all men are created equal in the Constitution of America. It makes no sense, right? But it's not supposed to make sense. That's the whole point of psychosis. So the actual book is actually it's really a structural argument saying, look, the political and economic system that we inhabit means a child dies every 10 seconds because they have got no access to food and water, and we have to look at the world through eyes that think that the blood on our hands is the sweat from our hard labor, because otherwise you have to fix it, right? So all these ways. So the book goes through like different things about like the day-to-day madness, being in universities, the media, stuff like that. But it's actually the actual argument is that, look, you can't get rid of whiteness without getting rid of the system that produces it. So actually my whole argument of that book is actually Back to Black was like, what is the Black revolution? What does that mean? Psychosis of Whiteness is, look, you need the revolution. The whole point is revolution. Otherwise you're not going to get rid of whiteness, because the anti-racism industrial complex will tell you that whiteness is, it can be taught out. You can journal your way through white supremacy. So, and that's like, honestly, it's the most dangerous set of ideas that we have.
Why do you think that? What is attractive about that argument? Like, is it just because it's not just a race hustle? I mean, there are those people, like we might point. Let me not name names, but there are. So I made a similar argument about when I wrote this critique of caste, right? The stupid fucking caste argument, right? But that this whole idea that racism is hearts and minds, and if people just change their morals and change the way we treat one another, like what is attractive about that argument, or what, other than it being maybe profitable or palatable, like what would lead rational thinking Black people to argue that?
So I think there's two things. One, I think, who's that for? So that's that best-selling stuff. That's not for us, right? That best-selling stuff. That's for what? That's for white audiences. They want to hear that. In fact, when I wrote New Age of Empire, the feedback was, "Can you make it more positive?" I was like, "No, I can't make it more positive. It's not positive. Like, why white supremacy is terrible?" Right? Because that's what they want to hear. And so there's an easy market for that. But I think it's worse than that, because Psychosis of Whiteness always stresses not just for white people. And actually most of the book is probably criticizing Black people. Because we fall into it, right? We want that. We want to believe that it's easy. We want to believe that we can be okay in the house. Because that's the thing now. Largely, I'm in that. In fact, I just gave this talk in the lecture today, was Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And the reality is, I'm in the house. I have more money than most people in the world. It will be very, very easy for me to fall into these delusions and say, "Oh, look, hard work, and we can just all get along." And that's the easy way to go about it, because that's what society tells us to do. So I think we fall into it because we want to fall into it, right? We want to feel comfortable in this wicked system.
I want to continue that conversation, but maybe shift gears a little bit to ask about the newer book that's coming out later on this year on Malcolm. And I'm thinking particularly about a lot of the controversy that came up after Manny Marable's book came out on Malcolm, which was A Life of Reinvention, and then some of the responses that came out, which came from folks like Jared Ball's work, A Lie of Reinvention, which was refuting a lot of the stuff that was in Marable's text. And so I'm wondering, one, if you could tell us a little bit more about the book and sort of what your reading or rereading of Malcolm's speeches and writings helps us understand, maybe newly or differently, about his legacy, and if there's anything particular on sort of his takes on gender or Black liberation or organizing. I would be specifically interested in some of those things.
Yeah, so for me, Malcolm's the most important intellectual of the 20th century. In fact, you read any of my books, it's just Malcolm. Honestly, it's just lots and lots of Malcolm. And so I always wanted to write a book which kind of just highlighted what is Malcolm X's political philosophy, because it's so misunderstood. And the life of reinvention, line reinvention, and the fact that you had to have a book that they got people who knew Malcolm together to say that book is so bad, just tells you how much the myths are. So the purpose of the book is to kind of burst the myths. Like, it kind of starts with the autobiography of Malcolm X, which isn't really the autobiography of Malcolm X, it's Alex Haley's version of Malcolm X's autobiography. And it doesn't include the organization of Afro-American Unity, the thing that Malcolm was doing when he was literally doing these interviews, he's doing it, and it's not in the book. So what we get from that book and then Life of Reinvention is we get Malcolm the anti-symbol, Malcolm the misogynist, Malcolm the anti-white, Malcolm the violent. You just get like it's easy to package on a poster, or you can put it on an X on the Spike Lee's movie. And that movie was, again, Denzel Washington, love him, great performance, but it did more harm than good because we really remember that performance. And so the purpose of the book really is say, well, actually, we see Malcolm all the time, but we actually don't really understand him. And so I wanted to go back to I listened to the speeches, I read the stuff, reread, because I kind of been, like I said, all my stuff is about Malcolm, really, and just brought the receipts, basically. Just said, look, this is the political philosophy, this is what it means, this is what he would say if he was alive now, this is what he'd say. Kind of my favorite chapter is called "You Left Your Mind in Africa," where I take to task contemporary people. I couldn't name names, I guess, but I leave it for the book. But yeah, take the task of people who are kind of leading us astray, because that definitely what Malcolm would have done. And just try to give a much fuller account of Malcolm, and particularly on the issue of gender, because look, Malcolm there was problems. Don't get me wrong, Nation Islam, deeply problematic. He's in the Nation of Islam for a very long time. But in that Marable book, there is a line where he says that Malcolm had a deep distrust for women. That's just not true. Like, it's just not true. His mother was his first influence. His sister was his biggest influence his whole life. Women like Lynn Shiflett in the OAU, like, ran the organization. It's just a bad argument, basically. So I was trying to get rid of some of the myths and say, look, if Malcolm was alive, what would he say today?
Also, this is I'm thinking about Malcolm, but the argument that you made about Malcolm and people trying to deal with a particular element of his life, to me, is also sort of reminiscent of Du Bois, where people sort of want to get stuck with Du Bois in the Talented 10th era. It's similar to Kwame Ture, where people want to get stuck with Kwame Ture in his Black Power era, even though he spent the last 30 years of his life, on the continent and promoting Pan-Africanism. So just as a follow-up, which is not really about Malcolm, but it's actually about that sort of tendency to want to congeal people in time. And I wonder just your own thoughts about what you think is sort of at stake in people's sort of intellectual and political agendas when they try to, when they force us to only think about these political thinkers as sort of static and not dynamic folks who have sort of developed and changed and thought with people and with the world as it changed over time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, people will use anybody like for their own ends, right? Like, and that's the question about psychosis with the anti-racism industrial complex. We'll just pick out the bits that we want, and it's easy to do. We like to do it, and to support whatever terrible argument that we have. So, like, for example, like it's in the Malcolm book, like Clarence X. There's a whole podcast on Clarence X, and I assume that was a full member of the Nation of Islam. No, it's Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas called himself Clarence X. I mean, madness. Like, how is that even remotely possible? But it just shows you that people can just pick out the bits. It's not just a Malcolm problem at all. I think it's particularly egregious with Malcolm, and that's why. And even there's some bits in there's some bits in the Malcolm stuff that I went back and said, well, actually, let me just listen to all of it. And the bits that I don't agree with, still they got to go in the book, because hey, that's the book, right? That's the work. And I just don't think we do that enough. More generally, we'll just pick out the bits that suit our agenda, really.
Well, I have like a similar question, but from the other end, like, what's the point of ventriloquizing Malcolm? Like, this is what he would say today. Who cares? I mean, I care, but like, what do we say? Like, how do we use the ideas, thoughts, and sort of struggles of like our intellectual heroes, like a Malcolm X, or me as Walter Rodney, for example, et cetera, et cetera. But what's the point of projecting what Malcolm X would say? Because also we don't know. We really don't know. Like, I would assume that Walter Rodney, if he were alive today, would not be a handkerchief head. That would break my heart. But you never know. So then what sort of intellectual political work does it do to sort of project what those ideas would be today?
Yeah, so actually, I mentioned this in the book. I have no idea. If Malcolm was still alive, he probably would have sold out because most people say that is what happens, right? And so, what Malcolm X the man alive today, God knows, I can't tell you what he'd say. However, Malcolm leaves a there is a political philosophy that has not been explored, that you will not find in any book. You cannot pick a book up right now that says this is Malcolm X's political philosophy. As much as we love him, as much as we hear in the poster, this is Malcolm X's political philosophy. And when you look at that philosophy, it gives you an analysis and it gives you a solution. And I would say that solution is the solution that we need today. So when I'm doing this, I'm saying, I'm showing you the whole way through the book, like this idea here around blackness, this idea here around revolution. This is what we actually need to do. And there is a blueprint to go and do it. So it's not just me saying, look, you can say, look, this is Malcolm's philosophy. This is why we should do it. And also, this is how we should do it. Because we started around the Organization of Black Unity based on the organization of OAU, Organization of Afro-American Unity. So I'm saying, look, this idea is the ideas we need to go along with. This is how it works now, and this is what we should be involved in.
Because I think about, for example, not to beat a dead horse, and we have other questions, but so I'm doing this speech on Malcolm X tomorrow. So I'm reading about, or like I was reading his speech and then the memo he wrote to like African heads of state about taking the United States to the United Nations. We see with what's happening with Palestine, there is, and he had said something like the international law is the only law that can hold the U.S. state accountable. International law is fucking bullshit. We see this starkly with Palestine, and it has been completely eroded. These international institutions, even with the paltry efforts that the ICC and the ICJ have made, we see the United Nations is absolutely has no authority or has no will to hold any settler colonies accountable. And so again, so like what is sort of possible and makes sense at a 1960s moment can't possibly. So what would be the sort of update to that now? Because it would not be taking the United Nations is sort of like a fucking shell corporation.
Yeah,
just before you answer that, because I wanted to also add this in context, because it made me think about there was an interview with Kwame Ture in the 80s where he talked about, in the 60s when he was working with SNCC, like, yes, he was, doing voter registration campaigns and really looking for the excitement of having, Black elected officials. And then he's like, 20 years later, we have 360 Black mayors and we have, all these people, and nothing materially has changed. And so even when we sort of think about what it is that these people would have wanted, even if there are things that they were saying in a particular space and time, once we have the evidence that doing those particular things has not produced the outcomes that we thought that they were going to produce, then I think it does make sense to ask that question, like, okay, well, what does it matter then to say what they would have said when they haven't learned the lessons that we've learned? They weren't up against the kinds of things they were up against now. And so they're just really existing in a very different type of world with a very different set of circumstances.
Yeah, but I think that's the benefit of the book, right? Like I'm looking back going, well, look, Malcolm, and the UN thing's in there, and I say, look, it don't work. It's obvious. Like it's the one bit of the book where I criticize and say, well, there's a different time, it's a different world, but you could have told, you should have known. Like Malcolm should have known. He should have known better than it was a mistake. It was clearly wrong. And I put that in the book. So look, there's the UN's a completely dead end. But actually, what was Malcolm actually doing? Malcolm was building the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and I'm saying that's the revolutionary vehicle. The UN stuff's kind of it's on the side. Part of it's just a tactic to kind of bring the African nations in. So I'm not in any way, no shape or form is a book to say, look, Malcolm said this, we should do this. It's actually, let's look at the overall philosophy. Let's look at what don't work. We can drop that. But actually, once you do that, you have this vehicle, OAU, the blueprint for it. You need to change it a little bit. Obviously, everything don't work exactly the same. But the basic revolutionary blueprint is there. The basic analysis is there. And we build on it and we take it forward. But it's definitely something to keep. And again, you won't find there's no book out there that will tell you, look, this is the philosophy of Malcolm X.
You must not have read Peniel Joseph. He's the expert on Malcolm.
Oh, I would say I read Peniel Joseph, and I still back up the statement.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit. So speaking of Malcolm X, you're actually helping to organize the Convention of African People, May 17th through 19th, 2025, right, for Malcolm X's 100th birthday. And this year it's going to be virtual, but next year it'll be in the Gambia in April. So can you tell us about the conference and your idea of what current Pan-Africanism should entail, or if Pan-Africanism is the framework you would use? And then also, how does this relate, if at all, to the Pan-African Congress that's supposed to be taking place in Togo?
So the inspiration for the Convention of African People very much was Malcolm. It's 100 Malcolm's on the birthday, and we were originally planning to have it in Gambia on his birthday, but the things are far more complicated to organize than you think, right? So we put it online, and the whole purpose of this was actually, this is one of the things that comes from the book, right? Is Malcolm is organizing OAU, but if you just organize in the West, it gets very liberal very quickly because it looks like it is a civil rights organization, right? Like voter registration, right, et cetera, et cetera. And the goal that Malcolm had, which again don't really work, is connect the OAU to the Organization of African Unity. And that is that's terrible. That's a terrible organization, and so we can't do that, right? So the edit we made was say, well, actually, no, you need the OAU, but you need the OAU on the continent. You need it in Latin America, you need it in North America, and you need to build a global organization from the beginning, not try to build a global organization from the West out. It don't work. And so that was the whole emphasis to say, well, let's have this, bring people together, try to connect the diaspora, bring people together on the continent, try to bring people in the continent. And actually, the reason we pushed it was because organizing on the continent is so difficult. My God, the colonial travel, everything is so much more complicated than I thought. So we pushed it to April. And so we're going to have online, try and get as many people engaged in May this year, around Malcolm's birthday, and then try to bring as many people we can together, physically together in Gambia in April. What was the other question? Pan-Africanism, I would say it's not. Pan-Africanism isn't what we like to think it is. Like, honestly, the Pan-Africanism there's lots of things, right? There's revolutionary Pan-Africanism, there's conservative Pan-Africanism, there's sellout Pan-Africanism. So I'd say it's a revolutionary version of Pan-Africanism, certainly, which tries to connect the grassroots across the continent and the diaspora.
Oh, we'll get to that. Your helmet.
No, I mean there is a longer conversation that I think I would like to have about that, but I want to lead into that by actually getting you to talk a little bit more about your experience, helping to co-facilitate the development of the first Black Studies degree in Britain, which I guess is, has been implemented for a little over a decade now at this point. So can you talk to us just about sort of what motivated you to create sort of a formal degree program in Black Studies, and then also talk about some of the challenges you face taking this on? Like what does Black Studies in Britain look like? Perhaps in relationship to what Black Studies in the US looks like, but that's not the most important thing. But just what are some of the contours of Black Studies in the UK, and what were some of the challenges that you faced in trying to create that as a degree program?
Well, I mean, we don't even have the undergraduate degree anymore. They got rid of it this year, so that tells you UK is really bad. Like, it's hard. It's just the biggest challenge we had was, we went. We took a model of Black Studies, where Black Studies is new in the university, but not in the UK. It's very much community. Like, my first book was about Saturday schools, voluntary education. We just started teaching our kids ourselves. There's British Black Power, same way in America, Black Power here. That's how I grew up. So I grew up in Black Power in Britain. So we tried to take that community knowledge and bring it into the university. Maybe it was a mistake. I don't know. The university never that happy with it. They always think about employability. It's just lots of problems. I mean, but the biggest problem we had was the university don't like to hire Black people. It's very difficult. Also, there's no. We were trying to do something community rooted, and you don't have people who are trained in that, right? Because the university doesn't train you to do that. You train to do other things, and so I don't know. If I look back, as much as I don't know. The students had a good time. It was great in that sense. We didn't want it to be the case that. So now, if you come into university in the UK, you basically study a white course. That you just do. There really aren't Black courses. You're gonna be alienated from the course. You're gonna be alienated from the staff. And we really wanted to say, well, actually, no. Let's have a degree where you can get your degree, and you can have a good experience, and you can be political, and you can do that. And so for that purpose, it was worthwhile. But it honestly never really fit too well. And if I'm honest, like I'm teaching it now, community and online. Maybe that's what we should have done in the first place, because it actually feels like a much more affirming thing to do. Because maybe the kind of Black Studies that at least I would like to do is probably incompatible with the university, the British university, but different.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess both you and Dr. CBS, we can have this kind of conversation as a bigger conversation. But I guess the sort of bigger question is, if so the project of Black Studies, if it is that it is about community, then what is at stake as we continue to sort of fight to have it as a sort of intellectual degree program in U.S. universities, and what that sort of looks like. So I mean, that's not really a question; it's just something I'm thinking about too, because I often struggle with that in the classroom now. I think right now, particularly as we are going through this moment where there is a decision to try to target anything that talks about Black people, gender, like whatever. And I've just been thinking a lot about, okay, so I think at High Point University in North Carolina, they have actually like officially pulled the plug and said that they're going to pull classes that say anything about Black, white, gender, whatever. And so then I'm really wondering if, like, for me, if it were the case that my university decided to do that, then what would I be doing? Because there's nothing for me to teach if that's not what I'm talking about. And so I wonder just sort of what maybe both of you all's thoughts are about that in sort of a general sense.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because what the thing about, and I talking about it just now actually in the classes, we want there's value in being in the institution. Like there's resources, there's resources, there's salary, there's things like which are important, right, that we need. But then also being in the institution kind of does change what it is. And I think in US Black Studies, I won't name any names, but I've visited a lot of places and I'm like, I don't really understand. Like you have the resources and you have everything I would think I wanted, but then we don't put it into practice. Like the Black Studies element, the community, the component, this is not there. And I think part of that is the problem of being institutionalized. But then at the same time, now in the States, there's an attack on it completely, and we're just going to cut it out. That seems like a loss. And I think it is. I guess my issue always is not necessarily with the system. The system is the system. My issue is with us. What are we doing? So if we're not really engaging and putting the community component back in there, we're not doing intersectional work, we can do that, right? But the jobs that we have are very, very flexible. There's so many things we can do. And I'll be 100% honest, the biggest barrier I've faced has not been universities, it's been Black scholars. If I'm being real, it's Black scholars has been the biggest barrier. So if we're going to push to have Black studies on campuses, we have to make sure it's a Black studies that is useful to the community. Really.
Well, I am classically trained in Black studies. Like all of my degrees are in the field. I have only taught in Black studies. I mean, I had a joint appointment when I was at Carleton College in political science. So I'm very ambivalent about Black studies. Sometimes I say I'm post-Black studies. My whole dissertation was a critique of Black studies and the cultural turn in Black studies, precisely because I think that the work that I do in some ways is because of Black studies, in some ways is despite Black studies. There's a lot of different hierarchies that have congealed in Black studies that are, I think, problematic. There is not very much of a community component, that's for sure. But at the same time, all of the university is a site of struggle, and I just don't believe in giving up shit just cause. Like that's what I've said this many times. Like the right wing understands that every single terrain is a terrain of struggle, which is why they're attacking the university, right? And so, like, do we just roll over and die? But it's that sort of conundrum, I guess, of defending a thing that I'm critical of, right? But that's because it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. But I don't know that it would not be, because there's a whole generation of scholars being trained in a particular way. I went to this Black Studies symposium at University of Buffalo, or like SUNY Buffalo, last week. I'm not going to say anything, but I went because I felt like I needed to sort of see what is happening. Yeah, so I don't know. So there's part of me that I think Black studies deserves to exist because our sort of four people struggle for that shit. And because we have other type of goofy, we have fucking Renaissance studies. So we should have Black studies. Like we have all this other goofy ass shit. It deserves to be in the academy like anything else. But to your point, it's like, what are we doing? Right? What are we doing? Are we just treating Black studies as sort of like a refugee camp whereby we're actually committed to other disciplines, but we don't like our white colleagues? So then we sort of take up space and gatekeep in Black studies, because that's also a problem, right? That even though we've had like 40 years of Black studies PhDs, our field still prefers to hire people with traditional disciplines. So there's a whole bunch of issues. Our professional organization gets treated like an ideological fiefdom for one particular approach to Black studies, right? So it's all of these issues. So I don't know. But to Layla's point, shit, I guess I'll start me OnlyFans when things go pear-shaped, because I don't have no other skills.
I was waiting for you to go somewhere like that. And
I'm gonna be OnlyFans, so.
But I think I'm always at risk of not being. I can't get a job in England, so I can't get another job. So if I lose this job, I'm in trouble. But I think part of that is then what are we building externally, right? So if we're working to build the organization of Black Unity, I would happy if I could afford it, I'd work there constantly. So I guess that for me is the project. How do we build the things that we then step into when the institutions fail us?
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of building things externally, so as we were getting ready for this interview, I was trying to find some of your stuff and read, and so I came across the piece that you wrote, which was called "Beyond Pan-Africanism: Garveyism, Malcolm X, and the End of the Colonial Nation State." My takeaway from that piece, and I don't know if you've written more about Pan-Africanism explicitly and where your thinking is on Pan-Africanism now, because I know that piece is a little bit old now. It was from 2017. But even in sort of thinking about Black studies, I know my experience, I can't say this is the experience writ large, but my experience with Black studies in the academy has been that Pan-Africanism, and the particular iteration of Pan-Africanism that I understand, which some might call a revolutionary Pan-Africanism, but Pan-Africanism as the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism is one that I think has been largely neglected sort of in Black studies. And so I'm wondering just sort of about, because you seem to have a critique of Pan-Africanism as this sort of bourgeois nation state program as it existed through the OAU and now through the African Union. And you mention like the Ghana-Guinea-Mali alliance. You give attention to, like, I guess Nkrumah and Touré and Keita as like sort of disparate strains of that. But I'm kind of wondering sort of what is at stake in one reading Pan-Africanism as primarily a bourgeois nation state project and not actually reading Pan-Africanism or the essence of Pan-Africanism as this sort of more revolutionary project.
Yeah, so interestingly, all that came from Back to Black. So Back to Black, retelling Black radicalism, 21st century, and originally that way we're taught, grew up anyway, was that Pan-Africanism is it's a logical endpoint of Black radical politics in the West. And it is that it's the Nkrumah, Touré, that unification of the continent. But then looking at the Pan-African, I was like, wow, this is not what Pan-Africanism is like. That is a version of Pan-Africanism. And actually, in Back to Black, what I was really trying to do was say, we just need to be really specific with what we're talking about. And if we actually think about Pan-African Congress movement, people like, you can't put Du Bois, Garvey, Nkrumah in the same. They're not the same. They're so different. We shouldn't even talk. We shouldn't give them the same label. And so the argument I'm making there is actually, if Pan-African, the dominant strain of Pan-Africanism, really from the Congress movement through to the OAU, through to the AU, is this bourgeois nation state led project, and the revolutionary aspect drops off. And so maybe just calling that Pan-Africanism, and then we can have revolution, whatever you want to call it, is something else, would understand these aren't the same thing. Because when we do this all the time in Black stuff, we just lump it together as though it's the same, even though there are deep ideological differences. And I think drawing out those differences are really important. And at least saying revolutionary Pan-Africanism was something, but there needs to be a distinction, because far too often in the literature conversation with people, the cultural bit gets lobbed in together, and we need to be much, much, much more clear, I think.
I also sort of wonder about the promotion, we like to think about Black nationalism as something that sort of supersedes the nation state, right? And I think that makes sense in the diaspora, because as African people in the diaspora, we are in these very sort of antagonistic, contentious, alienated relationships to the nations where we are, whether that be the UK, the US, even in places where we're in the majority, like Jamaica or Haiti, we still are in these kind of, contentious relationships. But then if we're thinking about, a revolutionary Pan-Africanist take on our relationship to the land, then I wonder where African nationalism fits, because you seem to be making an argument also that it's about like sort of Black nationalism is a mass project in a way that the push towards the African nation state is not. But I think there are some people who would argue that the push through the African nation state is a stages of development kind of thing, right? And so obviously the ultimate goal is not to have a Ghana, it's not to have a South Africa, it's not to have an Ethiopia, it's to have whatever, for lack of a better term, a federation of African states that governs itself according to the needs of the people, right? And so I think I'm wondering sort of even about that disparate reading of African nationalism or Black nationalism, because we're dealing with two very different sets of issues. Because on the African continent, we're talking about a place where the land is ours, as opposed to being, forcibly resettled, enslaved, whatever, in the diaspora. So those are very sort of different types of relationship to the land also.
Yeah, in terms of the land, but then the borders are just they're what? I mean, in some ways it's worse, right? Because their position, these nation states are completely made up, right? They're made up by Europeans who sit down with a map and outline it, and it's caused so many of the problems. So I'd say that actually the problem of nation states is somewhat different, but kind of state rooted in the same way. These aren't our nation states, and I think the problem is you had a lot of people arguing that the national, even Cabral, the national struggle leads to the continental struggle. No, it doesn't. The national struggle leads to the national liberation. And it stops there. History's told us that, right? And you get stuck in these Western nation state containers. So one of the things, actually, for the Malcolm thing, because Malcolm very much has faith in the OAU, in the African nation states, in the African head. And one of the things that I did for the book was say, well, actually, that clearly doesn't work. And actually, what we need to do is supersede the nation state. And if you're going to have an organization, it's an organization that has. So you have a chapter in Birmingham, you have a chapter in New York, you have a chapter in Lagos, you have a chapter, and that's the nationalism, where we actually just ignore the nation state. Not the land. The land's important, but the nation state is probably the worst way to run that through, particularly those colonial nation states, which are all imagined by Europeans.
You're muted, CBS.
Sorry. So no, I think I make a type of argument, a similar type of argument when I talk about from Pan-Africanism to Black internationalism, this piece that I wrote with Gerald Horn, whereby I do see Pan-Africanism as an ecumenical thing. It runs the gamut, right? Of which revolutionary Pan-Africanism is one aspect. And so to me, I said Black internationalism is the sort of revolutionary wing, right? Just in terms of typology. But at the same time, I would like the 1945 Pan-African Congress explicitly states that it's like workers and peasants who are the sort of arbiters of revolution. And so you're saying like Nkrumah and Du Bois basically can't be sort of in the same genealogy of Pan-Africanism. They were at the same conference. They're at the same Congress, and literally, and they are in relationship to what is it? The Black Communist Union conference that happened just previously. And so, to me, like they are part of the same nexus of sort of Pan-African ideology. Maybe not Garvey.
Except that Nkrumah said Garvey was the single most important thinker in his own development.
This is what I'm saying. And so, but Garvey, to me, Garvey's economic program is different, right? But Garvey's influences everybody. Then you have the African Blood Brotherhood, right? You have ABB, then you have like Hubert Harrison, the ABB, like Cyril Briggs, these revolutionary nationalists who are actually Pan-Africanists. So they're actually talking about the liberation of the continent. And they're not saying that the diaspora needs to redeem the continent in ways that Garvey did say that, right? This is Hubert Harrison's critique. This is Cyril Briggs' critique, et cetera. So all of this to say, I don't know that it's so... You can have all different types of anarchism, for example. I just taught unidot anarchism, which is why I'm even thinking about this, from like primitivism through to like anarcho-communism. So why can't Pan-Africanism also run the gamut? Like, why do we have to call these things different things?
Well, because, so, for example, like, definitely, like, Du Bois and Nkrumah are friends, but Nkrumah calls Du Bois a bourgeois Negro reformist. And that's his friend, right? Because he knows that everybody wants to liberate. I would not dispute that Du Bois wants to liberate Africa, but his version is so far away from Nkrumah's version, you can't do both things. Like, you just can't. It's so far away from Cabral's version, you can't do all those things. And I think, and this is one of my criticisms in the Malcolm book, actually, is, Malcolm's looking for unity, organized African American unity, and you bring together all the Uncle Tom leaders and you sit down at the table. But that's what that does is it destroys any revolutionary politics for the OAU, the Organized African Unity. When they put into the Constitution, number 2 of the Constitution, they compromise because they want to get everybody together, and they say you have sovereignty over your nation state. It's done then. It was done then. As soon as you say that, the whole thing's done. So we do need to understand that if we're not going in the same direction ideologically, it can't work, right? And what always ends up is you always end up compromising into these bourgeois Negro reformist ways, and we end up in the same place. I'm a hardline on that one. I think radical politics, and it just doesn't go with liberal politics. If you try and do both, you end up doing liberal politics every single time.
Right, but I think our point is like, who is the real Pan-Africanist then? Like, to reduce Pan-Africanism only to its bourgeois specification or its liberal specification is then to say, instead of acknowledging that there's an ideological spectrum, is to say that only the bourgeois Pan-Africanists are Pan-Africanists, and the people who are doing radical revolutionary work are doing something else.
I mean, I'm not prejudiced. Like, if you want to call it a spectrum and say it's revolution Pan-Africanism, it's liberal Pan-Africanism, that's fine. Or if you want to give it a different name, that's fine. But I think the key thing is to say, look, they're different projects. They are very different projects, and we can't do both. That's all I'd say.
Mm-hmm. We know ideology matters, James. We're talking about. Nobody saying that. That's not the crux of the argument.
No, I mean, it is clear that there were obviously ideological and practical material struggles. I mean, shit, even in Lumumba's assassination, right? Like Lumumba wanting to call in the UN and Secretary and Nkrumah being like, nah, we need to send African troops because that's why your ass is gonna end up getting chopped up. Yes, the conversation. I mean, I'm not saying that being dismissive or funny, but like that, you know, that was Secretary was adamant about that. He was like, no, like there absolutely needs to be no Western involvement in this. But he was adamant about that from the beginning when he came to power and kicking out the French, right? And yes, also I think we can acknowledge that the OAU itself was a compromise, and then obviously there were different ideological blocks between the Monrovia and the Casablanca groups. Like all of these things are true, but then I also think that and so this is something that I think happens a lot. There's a very different material reality in terms of us as intellectuals and academics sort of Monday morning quarterbacking and talking about like what it is that we can see based on all this, all this information that we now have, that these heads of states were literally in the mix trying to figure out in those moments, right? And so like I wonder what it means for us to, like in some ways, and I could be misreading your article, but in some ways to me, it felt like there was like a throwing away of Pan-Africanism in the article. And I just wonder what's actually at stake in that. If we're talking about a sort of a Black radical liberatory politics that is trying to create a new world for ourselves, what does it mean when we are saying that like, okay, Pan-Africanism is just this bourgeois nation state project that has made all these compromises and there's nothing to be sort of gleaned from these experiences, when in fact, even on the ground to this day in organizing spaces, Pan-Africanism, and this is not just in the US, this is not just sort of in the Anglophone world, I am encountering Pan-Africanism in Latin America and in places around the continent as a sort of ideological basis for people's actual organizing in this moment. So I wonder what it means for us as intellectuals in these kind of these higher up spaces to make arguments that then say, okay, this is the legacy of Pan-Africanism and this is why it's not useful.
Yeah, I think so. One, I would say this is the legacy of Pan-Africanism, and the legacy of Pan-Africanism as it's been organized is not useful and we should throw it away. And I would also in the second hand say revolutionary Pan-Africanism, yeah, we do shit everywhere. That's the answer. Don't throw that away too. We 100% need it. So if I made that much clearer, because revolutionary Pan-Africanism is a fundamental basis of Black radical thought and absolutely essential going forward. But I do think the liberal form of it, we can throw it away. We should throw it away. It is a dead end. It doesn't get you anywhere.
All right. Well, go ahead and gather your wedges while I read the last question. Okay, so I just wanted us to conclude by thinking about like the current moment. And what do you make of the current racial milieu in the US and the UK For example, the rise and consolidation of right-wing and fascist forces, the attack on DEI and wokeness, the ending of your Black Studies program, and the African Studies, like Hakeem Adi's African Studies thing, right? As you mentioned, the crushing of pro-Palestine activism and, our abetting of and funding of genocide, and just general white supremacist revanchism. Like, what should Black folks in academia be doing, and how should we be relating to movement?
Well, this is the moment where you need that community component of Black Studies, which is engaged, which is out there, right? This is, I would say, look, anybody who studies any of these things we're not surprised. Like, can you be surprised by any of this stuff? This is what it is, right? This is a moment where, if you want radical change, this is a positive moment, because you don't tend to get radical change when things are going well, right? They're never going well. When people think things are going well, that's not when you get radical change, right? In fact, there's a quote from Malcolm where he says, like, when someone's on a warm stove, they're not going to act. When you're on a hot stove, that's when you get up and react, right? And you can see Trump's coming. The UK's, we're back. Oh, geez, in a few years we'll have the first Black Prime Minister, Kemi Badenoch, and everybody will be like, we'll be crying about it. Like, it will not be a big Obama moment. We'll all be mad that she gave Prime Minister. So it's actually this is a perfect moment for the kind of scholarship that we need, right? To get out there, to be much more engaged. We might have a choice because we might get fired anyway, right? So we might literally have to be in the streets. So I'm not. This is a positive moment for radical change, because this is a time where you can actually see the realities of it very, very, very clearly, and hopefully it's a time where people who are going to move, are going to say let's do something different, are going to look for much more radical answers in a way that people don't do when they think there's hope, right? This happened under Barack Obama. You're not going to get radical change. Under Trump and this stuff, maybe you will, right?
Although I see a difference between the first Trump administration and in this one, there's like the Marx thing where it's like from in the 18th Brumaire, first time is tragedy, second time is farce. It seems flipped with this Trump shit. First time is farce, second time is tragedy, because whereas I think that people were fighting much, much more before, motherfuckers are tucking their tail and running to kick anything progressive off the sled as we like careen down this hill toward fascism, right? So we see universities, for example, preemptively getting rid of the DEI shit, preemptively getting rid of any mention of gender or sexuality or whatever might be attacked. And so I remember like the day, like January 21st, I guess, when Trump came into office and did the Muslim ban, people were like occupying airports and doing all kind of stuff. I think that because of the aftermath, number one, of the student encampments, number two, because of the the immigration realities, right? People getting deported and disappeared and attacked. It just feels like, yes, the contradictions are heightening, but the fight that seemed to be like the liberals coming to the streets in like 2016. Was that when it was 2016?
2017, because he was elected in 2016.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see the same, right? I don't see the same opportunity. So there's a whole accelerationist thing. And I personally, to a certain degree, I do think like Trump, right? People, like theoretically, right? People get more active when they feel like their rights are being abrogated or taken away. But I think it's a mixed bag at best right now, right? It seems like people are kind of, look at the Democrats. There was some opinion piece in the New York Times where dude said the Democrats, what they should do right now? Roll over and play dead, so that in the next election, people will miss them. It's like, is it fascism or not? Because if it's fascism, ain't gonna be no fucking next election. How about that? And so anyway, so to make a short story long, that long ass friend. Now yes, I hear you. And also looking, and I'm only thinking about the US context, I don't know if I'm seeing the fight, unless it's underground and I don't know, in which case I don't need to know about it, because it's told not to be so.
No, yeah, you're definitely right. So like there hasn't been, certainly it doesn't seem like there's been, and particularly from like institutions and stuff. But I think where I'm more optimistic, and maybe you haven't seen it yet, but I think it will happen, is the big problem, if I'm going to look back and say what's the big problem since Malcolm died, right? The big problem is that when Malcolm died, we were locked out. We were in the field. You weren't getting jobs here. You couldn't be prepared. None of us would be prepared. Like, come on, that's not happening, right? And the system changed enough so that we could get in. We could think we're going to have progress. We can think, and people said, okay, let's go along with it. Let's see where we're at. And I think you are seeing people see the limits of that, and actually maybe that don't work. And then when we're actually like they closed Black Studies, and we didn't protest about it. I didn't put no noise, didn't put no nothing out there. They said, you know what, let's do it in community, and that was a better option. And I'm like, actually, this is a better option, and there's a possibility that we do this now. We raise quite a lot of money from the one cause. We could potentially sustain the organization doing it in community, and maybe that was the right thing. And so maybe when we're forced out. And this is what we did in the 60s when we weren't in these institutions. What did we do? We did our own community education. We did our own things. We had our own institution. I would say that's the solution, is our own institutions. And when we're pushed out and got no choice, what we're going to do? We're going to go back and do our own institution where we can do our own stuff. And I think that's where there's an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that we're going to have to take. And I think it's an opportunity as academics have to say, we're in one of those places where we have flexibility to do things. And if we have the energy to do it, we can do it. And I think it's an area where we could actually lead, particularly in educational institutions and can we create independent Black education institutions? If ever there was a time for Black scholars to come together and do this, it's now, right? Because we're in jeopardy, like seriously, very much. And not just scholars, but even DEI professionals in America, people losing their jobs left, right, and center. So there's a model there to do it, and hopefully this can be the emphasis to do it. But we're gonna have to do it because like the conditions are always there, always there. They're always there. The racial capitalism, the conditions are always there. The question is how do we get enough people on board to actually move towards that? And I think one of the things that bothers me the most about academia is I hear a lot of people make the argument that's not our job. Our job is to tell you how it is. No, I don't think I do not believe that. Our job is to be there and do it. If I'm saying that's what we should do, let's go do it, right? If I'm saying build independence, I'll be out there doing it. And so I think we have to have that energy when we're addressing this too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as we like to say, we may be debating the merits of this from concentration camps. I'm trying to get my tent next to Layla's. She's brown, I'm Burden. I hope they do it alphabetical.
Hopefully they don't separate the kids,
Yeah, no, for my fucking dead body will they take some car. But yeah, so
well, I don't think they would be challenged by that.
Yeah, listen, it's like, all right, take her, but somebody's coming with me. Like Malcolm said, what is it? Make it a fair exchange. Fair exchange ain't no robbery. Shit. Well, thank you. I don't know, Layla, did you have anything else that you wanted?
I know I was muted when I said I was just saying we definitely have much work to do. That is for certain. If we did not think that before, we have to know that now. So.
Yeah, I just stress like when I do this Malcolm stuff, we're trying to put it in practice. So we're having the Convention of African People. It'll be online May the 17th to 18th. All the details at Make It Plain, make-it-plain.org. And the plan is to have let's see where we get to, right? Try to build the organization and try and put it into practice. Let's do it. That's my mind. So let's try. If it don't work, it don't work. But you can't learn the theory without doing it. Effectively.
Yeah. So where can people find you, or like where do you want people to go? Where can they sign up to attend the virtual Pan-African or what is it called?
Convention of African People.
You said
Make It Plain. So it's make-it-plain.org.
Okay.
All the details are up there. We have a website where we've got different articles, podcasts, and stuff like that. You can join. So around the organization of Black Unity, we're trying to get people to join. And the whole purpose of the convention is can we set up chapters in different parts of the diaspora and on the African continent as well. So that is blackunity.org.uk. Yeah, blackunity.org.uk. People can find out more about that. And I'm on Twitter. I can't call it whatever Elon Musk thing is. So just
that's why I know that not. Well, I don't know, but every time I see any Tesla, I just want to throw something at it, and I don't care who's driving it.
There's been a lot of Tesla vandalism. There you go. There's the activism. There's been a lot of Tesla vandalism.
Oh, God.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kehinde. Hopefully, we can be in conversation again, and y'all make sure you hit up these links. And yeah, let's talk again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
All right.
Wait,
so see, we had a British bloke. But how we
do not disturb is supposed to be and I'm joking.
I don't even know. The thing is, I don't even know where my phone is. It is somewhere else. But okay, so question is, have we had Was Kelly this season or last season? Have we had any women on? Or non-men?
Or
Are we being
non-men? Honestly, I can't. The seasons be running together for me, so I don't know. I feel like it wasn't. Kelly was not this season.
Chat, have we only had men this season? Let us know.
Because this is only episode 4, so yeah, I don't think we have had any women.
We had Michael, and then before Michael, we had.
Ori. We didn't have. We've only had. Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's only been men this season.
We need to do better.
Ralph said we very anti-feminist.
We listen. I might have been about that. But we're women. We count. We count.
And it is not like we just posting. Our commentary is always there.
Mm-hmm. Heard about the Teslas in Las Vegas? Yes, I did.
Who's didn't.
Women communists inspire you most? Louise Thompson Patterson, Claudia Jones, Esther Cooper Jackson, Maud White Katz, and Marvell Cook.
That was also just making me think about the show that we did with Musa and
Darian.
Where because we went over like 20 Pan-African women and Black lesbian women. So we might have to revisit something like that this season. We have the Andre Bluen book on the roster coming up. Maybe we might find a woman scholar to be in conversation with about that. We actually were trying to organize something to talk about these 2 books that came out, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge and Vengeance Feminism, but it's kind of halfway fallen through, still kind of working the details out of that. So up to this point, that has been what has been the case, but
yeah.
So speaking of which, we're gonna read Walter Rodney.
Yeah, right. Oh God, my Walter. What I do want to do, I meant to talk to you about this, is like maybe do a show where we showcase like people who are advanced graduate students about to graduate, people who newly graduated, to talk brief, like a kind of like a, what is it? Not a round table, but like I forget what they're called, but they do like a flash something. They present posts. They have them at conferences. Anyways, because there was this dude, he's white, not gonna lie, but met him at the People's Forum. He does like jazz and Black liberation or something like that. And he's adjuncting right now. And so he was, he's kind of like wanting to get his work out there and something. And so I think that we should have a show where people can come on and just talk about their work. And
that would be fun. I was watching, my dad shared an interview with me that Gerald Horne just did the other day, and somebody had asked him about his practice of like citing dissertations, and he was just talking about how so much good work does not end up getting published, or isn't published for a really long time, because a lot of doctoral students are doing good work, but it doesn't necessarily see the light of day as a book or whatever else. They might go on and do something. So I think that would definitely be something worth doing, thinking about what types of graduate students are doing stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not gonna say that's cap, but okay. That's not cap.
Oh, somebody set fires at a Tesla dealership. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't me, but I support their decision.
Okay, so y'all, since it's Walter Rodney's birthday coming up, we want to, and because we had this conversation about Pan-Africanism, we want to read this piece by Walter Rodney that's also about Pan-Africanism. I dropped the link in the chat. We don't have it in the folder because it's in the chat. It's located on, what is it? This called Marxist.org or something. It's pretty long, but I think that it really gives. So basically, this article is about. So this is prior to the six-pack, right, which happened in Tanzania in 1976, and so he has a pretty stringent critique of what's actually happening at that moment on the African continent and where Pan-Africanism has gone. That sort of is in conversation with what we were talking to Kehinde about. So we want to read this piece. So bear with us. It's pretty long, but it's actually really interesting. And just have a conversation throughout.
Okay. Aspects of the international class struggle in Africa, the Caribbean, and America. I just want to move this way so I'm not looking to the side. Political conferences of the oppressed invariably attract a variety of responses, varying from cynical conviction that they are an utter waste of time to naive optimism that they will change the face of the world. In actuality, popular struggle continues from day to day at many different and more profound levels, and its intensity at any given time primarily determines the relevance and utility of the conference as a technique of coordination. The Sixth Pan-African Congress, scheduled for Dar es Salaam in June 1973, my mind is in 2020, consciously aims at being heir to a tradition of conferences which grew out of the response of Africans to their oppression in the first half of this century. Therefore, its rationale must be sought through a careful determination of the coordinates of the contemporary endeavors of the African people everywhere. Since the Fifth Pan-African Congress held in Manchester in 1945, the political geography of Africa has been transformed by the rise of some 40 constitutionally independent political units presided over by Africans. This is to state the obvious. Yet, following in the wake of the great pageant of the regaining of political independence, there has come the recognition on the part of many that the struggle of the African people has intensified rather than abated, and that it is being expressed not merely as a contradiction between African producers and European capitalists, but as a conflict between the majority of the Black masses and a small African possessing class. This admittedly is to state the contentious, but the Sixth Pan-African Congress will surely have to walk the tightrope of this point of contention. Any pan concept is an exercise in self-definition by a people, aimed at by establishing a broader redefinition of themselves than that which has been so far permitted by those in power. Invariably, however, the exercise is undertaken by a specific group or class which speaks on behalf of the population as a whole. This is always the case with respect to national movements. Consequently, certain questions must be placed on the agenda, notably the following. Which class leads the national movement? How capable is this class of carrying out the historical task of national liberation? And which are the silent classes on whose behalf national claims are being articulated?
So the significance of the above questions emerges clearly in the classic case of Pan-Slavic nationalism. The Pan-Slavic ideology of the late 19th century and the turn of this 20th century, at the turn of this century, offered the Slav peoples of Eastern Europe a unified vision of themselves, aiming to transcend the fragmentation, which was a consequence of the powerful waves of imperial expansion that had struck the shores of the Adriatic and the Black Sea. The Slav intelligentsia who advocated Pan-Slavism were spokesmen of emergent bourgeois forces in the clash against feudalism, and their position also reflected some sympathy for the oppressed peasantry, since it was in the interest of capitalism that serfdom be removed. But their hopes were frustrated because they failed to unseat indigenous and external feudal oppressors, including their Slav brothers who formed the ruling class in Tsarist Russia. Subsequently, the local Balkan bourgeoisie were unable to or unwilling to confront capitalist imperialist partition, and the region gave rise to the term Balkanization as a supreme expression of the failure to carry out the task of national liberation and unification. It was left to the Balkan masses under working class leadership, albeit under conditions of war, to tackle effectively the problem of nationalism and of broader Eastern European unity in the period after the Second World War. Significantly enough, they did so within the context of a socialist reconstruction, a task which was beyond groups benefiting from capitalist exploitation. Pan-Africanism in the post-independence era is internationalist insofar as it seeks the unity of peoples living in a large number of juridically independent states. But it is simultaneously a brand of nationalism, and one must therefore penetrate its nationalist form to appreciate its class content. This exercise is made easier by the fact that the nationalist movements in Africa, which led to the regaining of independence in more than 36 states, constitute a phenomenon which has already received considerable attention. These movements were essentially political fronts or class alliances in which the grievances of all social groups were expressed as national grievances against the colonizers. However, while the workers and peasants formed the overwhelming numerical majority, the leadership was almost exclusively petty bourgeois. Understandably, this leadership placed to the fore those national aims which contributed most directly to the promotion of their own class interests. But they voiced sentiments which were historically progressive, partly because of their own confrontation with the colonialists and partly because of pressure from the masses. Pan-Africanism was one of these progressive sentiments, which served as a platform for that sector of the African or Black petty bourgeois leadership, which was most uncompromising in the struggle against colonialism at any time during the colonial period.
Virtually all leaders of African independence movements paid at least lip service to the idea that regional freedom was only a step towards the freedom and unity of the whole continent. And the most advanced nationalists were usually the most explicit on the issue of Pan-African solidarity. Nkrumah and Kenyatta were both at Manchester, while Nyerere, Kaunda, and Mboya were the driving forces behind the Pan-African movement for East and Central Africa, PAMECA. Within the Francophone sphere, several leaders took Pan-Africanist positions in one form or another. The Popular Union of Cameroon refused to accept colonial boundaries in Africa. Senghor espoused a culturally oriented doctrine of Black internationalism, comparable to Pan-Africanism, and even Houphouët-Boigny was initially associated with a political party which was Pan-Africanist in thrust, namely the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which addressed itself to the whole of the French West Africa. Pan-African solidarity also manifested itself with regard to the War of Independence in Algeria, an episode of which united not merely North Africa, but also helped force alliances between progressive nationalists on both sides of the Sahara. Similarly, the rise of national liberation movements dedicated to achieving freedom by any means necessary served to underscore the reality of Pan-Africanism. All African leaders had to concede that freedom in Southern Africa was vital to guarantee the freedom of any given part of Africa. And the testament of practice showed that commitment was greatest in the case of the most forward-looking of the petty bourgeois regimes: Ghana under Nkrumah, Egypt under Nasser, Tanzania, Zambia, and Guinea. It would be unhistorical to deny the progressive character of the African petty bourgeoisie at a particular moment in time. Owing to the low level of development of the productive forces in colonized Africa, it fell to the lot of small privileged educated groups to give expression to mass grievances against racial discrimination, low wages, low prices for cash crops, colonial bureaucratic commandism, and the indignity of alien rule as such. But the petty bourgeoisie were reformers and not revolutionaries. Their class limitations were stamped upon the character of the independence which they negotiated with the colonial masters. In the very process of demanding constitutional independence, they reneged on the cardinal principle of Pan-Africanism, namely the unity and indivisibility of the African continent.
So this reminds me of when Harry Haywood is talking about the sort of the Black petty bourgeoisie at the end of the 19th and in the beginning of the early 20th century, that initially they're progressive, right? Vis-a-vis the mainstream politics, because they're anti-white supremacy, they're for Black freedom, Black equality, etc. But they are effectively reformist and not revolutionary. And so at a particular moment, it's not trans-historical. At a particular moment, if they don't commit class suicide, they become the reactionaries. Mm-hmm. So the first Pan-Africanists to engage in the political mobilization of the African masses on African soil had a continental outlook. The African National Congress, which was formed in the Union of South Africa in 1912, aimed at being African and not merely South African, and it was renamed in 1923 to emphasize this fact. Significantly, organizations of the same name extended into what is now Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania. It is also significant that dynamic African spokesmen of the 1930s like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Wallace Johnson were African rather than Nigerian or Sierra Leonean. But the lawyers and place seekers who eventually took the independence movement in hand were incapable of transcending the territorial boundaries of the colonial administrations. Imperialism defined the context in which constitutional power was to be handed over so as to guard against the transfer of economic power or genuine political power. The African petty bourgeoisie accepted this, with only a small amount of dissent and disquiet being manifested by the progressive elements such as Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Sékou Touré. Areas of West and Central Africa, which experienced French colonial rule, witnessed the shameless dismantling of their colonial politics, which had a large territorial base. Whereas the French had maintained unity for exploitation, the African petty bourgeoisie lacked the capacity to demand both unity and freedom. So they accepted the balkanization, which led to fragments called Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, and so on. Since independence, little or no progress had been registered with respect to reversing this balkanization. It is a striking historical fact that the bourgeoisie proper have been the spearheads of national unity in which capitalism was first engendered. They sought political unity to guarantee the integration of production and distribution, giving rise to what were then relatively large nation states in Britain, France, and Germany, as compared to the numerous feudal fiefs which previously existed. The North American continent provides the most formidable example of the identification of the bourgeois interest with federal unity and with the building of an infrastructure which rolled across a whole continent without regard to the cost and blood, especially since the blood spilt was principally African and Native American.
The petty bourgeoisie of Asia, Africa, and Latin America are a different breed. They cannot be described as entrepreneurs, pioneers, captains of industry, robber barons, or any other of the swashbuckling terms coined to glorify the primary accumulation of capital. Frantz Fanon flays them unmercifully, but truthfully when he points to the shoddy, imitative, lackluster character of the African petty bourgeoisie. Their role in the international capitalist system has always been that of compradors. Their capital outlay might often be greater than that of a factory owner during the Industrial Revolution. Their capital outlay might often be greater than that of a factory owner during the Industrial Revolution in England during the early 19th century, but in the present era of monopoly capitalism, it suffices mainly for chicken farms. In any event, most of the African petty bourgeoisie is not directly involved in economic enterprises. Their real sphere being the professions, the administration, and the military police hierarchy. They lack both the vision and the objective base to essay the leap towards continental unity. A close scrutiny further reveals that the failures of the African ruling class to effect meaningful unity is not merely due to weakness. Recalling once more the dismantling process which took place in Francophone Africa at the time of negotiated independence, it can be seen that the pusillanimity of the African petty bourgeoisie in the face of the deliberate creation of non-viable dependent mini-states by France arrests not merely to the strength of the colonizers, but also to fear on the part of the presumptive African rulers that larger territorial units might have negated their narrow class welfare. Throughout the continent, none of the successful independence movements denied the basic validity of the boundaries created a few decades ago by imperialism. To have done so would have been to issue a challenge so profound as to rule out the preservation of the petty bourgeois interest and a compromise independence worked out in conjunction with international capital. Just as a pause, I know my picture is freezing. Is my voice freezing? My voice is not freezing.
No, it's not. Just quickly, so Allison said, thought this conference was 1974. It is 1974. I think I said 1976 by accident. And so this was written in 1974, but published in 1975, which was why I was thinking it was 1976, because I'm like, he wrote this before the conference, but it was 74. Then there was something from Dejuma Boutique who said, was this 1973 meeting a result of the 1963 Addis Ababa meeting? Do you know, Layla?
Was it a result of that meeting? So I know that part of the I don't know the answer to that directly, but I just know that in trying to restore, or not even restore because it hadn't been, but in trying to take the character of the Pan-African Congresses back sort of to the masses, to the African continent, because up until this point there had not been one on the African continent. There was an attempt to do so, but this is also 70. So what? Nkrumah was overthrown in what, 69, I believe. 66. I'm bad with years, y'all. But also in sort of thinking about, like, so now that we're in this, now that the kind of what would you call it, the sort of critical seat of the sort of vision of Pan-Africanism has been lost, like this is also, I think, regrouping efforts also as well happening in 74.
Okay. So we're at a close scrutiny, right? A close scrutiny further reveals.
Yes.
Okay. A close scrutiny further reveals that the failure of the African ruling class to effect meaningful unity is not merely due to weakness. Did you read this? Yeah, I think you read that, right? No?
Oh, sorry. Wait. Yes.
Okay. If the weakness of the present petty bourgeois leadership of Africa were the only problem, then they could be dismissed as passive bystanders who cannot make operational the potential Pan-Africanism as an ideology of liberation. However, they maintain themselves as a class by fomenting internal divisions and by dependence on external capitalist powers. These policies are antithetical to Pan-Africanism. The record since independence confirms that the interests of the African petty bourgeoisie are as irreconcilable with genuine Pan-Africanism as Pan-Africanism is irreconcilable with the interests of international capitalism. Kehinde. Most African states are engaged in consolidating their territorial frontiers and preserving the social relations prevailing inside these frontiers and in protecting imperialism in the form of the monopolies in their respective states. The capitalist superpowers, directly and indirectly, individually and collectively, guarantee the existence of the African petty bourgeoisie as a ruling class and use them to penetrate and manipulate African society. This has been done so crudely and openly that one does not have to be especially informed or especially aware in order to perceive what has been going down. Ex-ambassadors of the U.S. have a way of reminiscing on how they cynically maneuvered the Reds and Blacks. Local representatives of American, British, and French security forces are so entrenched that they dispense with all cover. And the African petty bourgeoisie itself is so gauche that it rushes openly to the defense of an international monopoly such as Lanarho, which when even the metropolitan political rulers are too embarrassed to do so.
All the activities of international capital aim at perpetuating the division of the continent, which they initiated at the time of the partition. The petty bourgeoisie is also showing that it seeks to maintain division of the African masses, since the anti-colonial alliance with all of the other classes has gained its objective of formal independence. The only alliance which the African ruling class now vigorously defends is that with imperialism against the African people. Most decidedly, the power structure does not want to allow the masses either the consciousness or the reality of unity. Pan-Africanism has been so flouted by the present African regimes that the concept of Africa is dead for all practical purposes, such as travel and employment. The Africanization that was aimed against the European colonial administrators soon gave way to restrictive employment and immigration practices by the Ivory Coast, Ghana under Busia, Zaire, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and others, aimed against Dahomians, Nigerians, Burundi nationals, Malawians, Kenyans, and all Africans who were guilty of believing that Africa was for the Africans. Of course, it was said that unemployment among citizens of any given country forced the government to take extreme steps. This is a pitiable excuse, which tries to hide the fact that unemployment is the responsibility of the neo-colonial regimes, which can know nothing better than preside. Maybe they're supposed to be do nothing better than preside over. Can do nothing better than preside over dependent economies with little growth and no development. In many respects, one African has been further shut off from one another during the present neo-colonial phase than was the case during raw colonialism. Even within the context of the existing African nation states, the African ruling class has seldom sought to build anything other than tribal power bases, which means that they seek division and not unity at all levels of political activity, be it national, continental, or international. We definitely listen. Right now, I am going down the rabbit hole of corrupt talk on TikTok, where there are all these fucking videos of Tinubu's raggedy ass embezzling money.
Shit, Kagali's goofy ass.
Yes.
Okay, so the dominant mode of thinking in Africa today is inherited from the colonial masters and is given currency by the state apparatus. Not surprisingly, therefore, the very concept of class is ignored or mystified. The petty bourgeoisie get very upset at being called petty bourgeois and strenuously deny that there are any class differences between themselves on the one hand and the workers and peasants on the other. It is not surprising that socialism has been enemy number one for so many African states. African leaders fight the bogey of communist threat, rather than the reality of capitalist imperialist oppression. Ooh, that's a bar. Even the most progressive of this ruling class harbor and protect local constitutional independence. The various parts of Africa have scored no victories. Sorry. No. Even the more progressive of this ruling class harbor and protect local reactionaries while neutralizing or eliminating Marxist and other left-wing elements. In 10, 12, or 15 years of constitutional independence, the various parts of Africa have scored no victories in ending exploitation and inequality. On the contrary, social differences have increased rapidly, and the same applies to the amount of surplus extracted by foreign monopoly capital. In the spheres of production and technology, the so-called development decade of the 60s offers the spectacle of decreasing agricultural production, a declining share of world trade, and the proliferation of dependency structures because of the further penetration of multinational corporations. All of these matters are highly relevant to a discussion of Pan-Africanism. The transformation of the African environment, the transformation of social and productive relations, the break with imperialism, and the forging of African political and economic unity are all dialectically interrelated. This complex of historical tasks can be carried out only under the banner of socialism and through the leadership of the working classes. The African petty bourgeoisie, as a ruling class, used their state power against socialist ideology, against the material interests of the working class, and against the political unity of the African masses.
Absolutely. Of course, the rhetoric of the African ruling class is something else. Only Abanda has the temerity to openly abuse the concept of African unity, and only a few others would openly espouse capitalism and imperialism as decent and just. Otherwise, the petty bourgeoisie prefers the technique of paying lip service to progressive ideas, seeking the defeat of these rather than a process of trivialization and vulgarization. Both socialism and Pan-Africanism are of the utmost importance with respect to this technique. And this is the issue that I have with the way I felt like Kehinde just kind of threw away Pan-Africanism in that particular piece that I read. In one sense, the unwillingness of the petty bourgeoisie to manifest overt hostility to socialism and Pan-Africanism is a testimony to the development of mass consciousness and to the level of confrontation between progressive and reactionary forces on the world stage. But it is also very insidious insofar as pseudo-revolutionary positions tend to preempt genuinely revolutionary positions. For instance, the existing African regimes have helped create the illusion that the OAU represents the concretization of Pan-African unity, and it does not. The OAU is the principal instrument which legitimizes the 40-odd mini-states visited upon us by colonialism. It is a tribute to the momentum of Pan-Africanism that the OAU had to be formed. The idea of Pan-African political unity had to take deep roots, and it had to be given expression, if only in the form of a consultative international assembly. This indicates a higher level of continental political coordination than was to be found in Latin America during the period when the old colonial regimes were being demolished. It is also true that no imperialist power is a voting member of the organization in the way that the United States of America is entrenched within the OAS, or the Organization of American States. Nevertheless, the OAU does far more to frustrate than to realize the concept of African unity. The degree of its penetration by imperialist powers has been evidenced on numerous occasions, the most striking being those which have arisen around the unilateral declaration of independence by the white minority in Zimbabwe, around the issue of dialogue with the white racist South African regime, and over the persistence of the French in selling arms to the Republic of South Africa.
At best, the OAU regulates a few internal conflicts between the petty bourgeoisie from different parts of the continent. Beyond this, it is committed to maintain the separation of African peoples implicit in the present territorial boundaries, so as to buttress the exploitative social systems which prevail on the continent in this neo-colonial epoch. When Lumumba was waging his heroic battle against imperialism in the Congo, it seemed for a brief while that there would be an alignment of progressive versus reactionary African forces. The masses of Africa were only too anxious to join their Congolese brothers in the fight against white and black mercenaries. Indeed, the lines were drawn so clearly that internal revolutionary solidarity was forthcoming from many parts of the world. However, the continent suffered a setback in the Congo. Affairs in the Congo were normalized to the point of changing the country's name to Zaire. Meanwhile, one of the most important principles accepted by African governments in the wake of the defeat of the Congolese was that no popular dissident movement in an independent African country can be supported by any group or government in another independent African country. In constitutional terms, this is expressed in the fine-sounding phrase, non-interference in the internal affairs of a member state. In practical terms, this is how the most reactionary elements of the petty bourgeoisie tie the hands of the masses of Africa. One of the cardinal principles of Pan-Africanism is that the people of one part of Africa are responsible for the freedom of their brothers in other parts of Africa. And indeed, Black people everywhere were to accept the same responsibility. The OAU denies this, apart from areas still under formal colonial rule. By so doing, they are implying that the objective conditions which impelled African masses to fight the colonialists have since been transformed, which is a blatant falsehood. Any exploitative, oppressive, and autocratic African state is cordoned off against fellow African intervention or criticism, even when the most elementary civil and human rights are trampled upon. Meanwhile, the more progressive states are not really protected against intrigues and various forms of aggression arranged by imperialism through the agency of the adjacent neo-colonial African states. And in any event, socialism cannot be built in any one African country, so that the few initiatives towards socialist transformation on the continent are bound to be stifled by the continued division of Africa into artificial states.
The question posed at the outset of this analysis in relation to the class content of nationalism suggested that one identifies the leading class, assesses its revolutionary capacity, and evaluates the manner in which the subordinate classes are handled. Our conclusions at this point are that the African petty bourgeois leadership since independence has been an obstacle to the further development of the African Revolution. A final illustration to this effect is the way in which the very vanguard of the Pan-Africanist movement, as it emerged from the Fifth Congress, lost its direction and wallowed in bourgeois theory and practice. Like other African leaders, they too propagated the false antithesis between Pan-Africanism and communism, an intellectual activity spearheaded by no less a person than George Patmore. Understandably, his practical politics suffered a corresponding decline. And in spite of once having stood in the ranks of the international working class movement, Patmore found himself intervening in Guyana in the mid-1950s on the side of the section of the local leadership, which was supported by the British and American governments, by local and foreign capitalists, and by the CIA-infiltrated trade union, the AFL-CIO. At the same time, Nkrumah was engaging in ideological mystification under new facades such as conscientism, while doing little to break the control of the international bourgeoisie or the Ghanaian petty bourgeois over the state. I'm just trying to remember because conscientism came out when he was still in office or if he had already been out of office. He had already eliminated the genuine working class leadership from the CPP during the first years of power, and it was only after his overthrow by a reactionary petty bourgeois coup d'etat that Nkrumah became convinced that there was a class struggle in Africa and that the national and Pan-African movements required leadership loyal to its mass base of workers and peasants. Obfuscation of the notion of class in post-independence Africa has made Pan-Africanism a toothless slogan as far as imperialism is concerned, and it has actually been adopted by African chauvinists and reactionaries, marking a distinct departure from the early years of this century when the proponents of Pan-Africanism stood on the left flank of their respective national movements on both sides of the Atlantic. The recapture of the revolutionary initiative should clearly be one of the foremost tasks of the Sixth Pan-African Congress.
Although New World Black representation predominated at all Pan-African congresses and conferences in the past, the agendas were usually devoted almost exclusively to the affairs of the African continent. It can be assumed that the Sixth Pan-African Congress will not be substantially different, but the creation of independent Caribbean nation states does introduce a new dimension with regard to the participation of this part of the Black world. Having sketched the main outlines of a petty bourgeois position in Africa, it is unnecessary to elaborate on the Caribbean scene because of the numerous and basic similarities. It is to be noted, however, that that which appears as a tragedy against the vast backcloth of African reappears as comedy in the Caribbean. Earlier this year, the people of the then colony of Grenada took to the streets to express in uncompromising terms their opposition to the exploitative and oppressive system of government of Anglo-American colonialism, which is manned locally by a certain petty bourgeois clique. At the same time, the British government carried on regardless in its plans to grant independence to the said petty bourgeois clique, expressing reservations only on the point of whether or not it was safe to send a member of the royal family to preside over the independence ceremony. As it was, militant striking workers deprived the independence celebrations of telephone services, port services, and electricity, but the petty bourgeoisie regime managed to add some fireworks to mark the auspicious occasion. What term other than comedy can describe such a situation? The ruling class in each given British Caribbean territory usually takes pains to create a national identity, which amounts to little more than glorifying the fact that some Africans were sent to slave plantations in Jamaica or Trinidad rather than Barbados or Antigua, as the case may be. On the basis of this quote-unquote nationalism, the petty bourgeoisie can continue the former British colonial policy of preventing trade unionists and progressives from moving freely amongst the people of the Caribbean. Another antic, which is common on the part of the West Indian regimes, is that they operate against unarmed national liberation movements inside the Caribbean while fully proclaiming support of African liberation movements in Southern Africa. This latter posture, along with the other pro-African rhetoric, was forced on several West Indian leaders because of popular sympathy for the African cause at the mass level. The posturing and rhetoric are extremely useful on jaunts to Africa in their quest for class alliances with the African petty bourgeoisie itself.
Yet the realities of state power have predetermined that when the Sixth Pan-African Congress meets in Dar es Salaam in June 1974, it will be attended mainly by spokesmen of African and Caribbean states, which in so many ways represents the negation of Pan-Africanism. One immediate consequence of the rise of constitutionally independent African and West Indian states is that for the first time, such a gathering will be held on African soil and will be sponsored, directed, and attended mainly by Black governments rather than by Black intellectuals as such, or by small Black protest organizations, as was the case up to the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester. Already it is clear that states will be represented as states and that the OAU will play some role. When a few individuals began to contemplate this Congress some years ago, it was felt that it should be a coming together of Black political movements as distinct from governments. One school of thought envisaged that it would be a select conference of the most progressive elements in the Black world. To a large extent, this was the significance of the All-African People's Congress held in Accra in 1958. However, plans for a similar meeting in the 1970s would be hopelessly idealist. The African radicals of 1958 are by and large the incumbents in office today. The radicals of today led at best an uncomfortable existence within African states, while some languish in prison or in exile. The present petty bourgeois regimes would look with disfavor at any organized program which purported to be Pan-African without their sanction and participation.
None of the progressive African regimes, which are already isolated and exposed to internal-external reaction, would dare to host a Congress which brought together only those who aggressively urge a unity of the African working masses in the building of a socialist society. Such a Congress would have to be held in a metropolitan center and would thus condemn itself to serve primarily as a forum for alienated intellectuals. That's what the Tricontinental Congress was, though. Conference 1996. It had like Cabral and all those like revolutionary groups. How much things change in like less than a decade. Anyway, in the light of the above considerations, any African committed to freedom, socialism, and development would need to look long and hard at the political implications of participation in the Six Pack. The purists might be tempted to eschew any association whatsoever, but revolutionary praxis demands that one should contend against class enemies in theory and in practice by seizing every opportunity to utilize all the contradictions within imperialism as a global system. In this instance, contradiction born of economic exploitation and racist oppression. Without falling into the trap of imagining that the present states of Africa and the Caribbean will liberate the African masses from the tyranny of man and nature, it still remains an open political question as to how far they can be pressured to take steps which lessen the immediate impact of imperialist exploitation and which perhaps grant respite to the producers and progressive forces. Southern Africa provides excellent illustrations to this effect. Our brothers in the South are striking blows, which include attacks on enemy bases in Angola, the destruction of rail links in Mozambique, the disruption of production through strikes in Namibia and South Africa, and the intensification of political military offensives in Zimbabwe. The leadership, even in the most reactionary African states, have found it difficult to avoid responding in some positive manner to these activities. Just as liberal organizations and governments of the capitalist world are now finding it prudent to join socialists and radicals in giving international support to African liberation movements. It will be naive to abstain from participation in the forums where both processes are taking place, because a committed presence is essential both to accelerate as well as to control contributions which could otherwise cease to be merely opportunist and become actively counter-revolutionary.
Turning to the economic policy of African regimes, one also perceives that the dilemma of increasing underdevelopment places the petty bourgeoisie on the defensive. Whether within the OAU or in a wider non-aligned context, they can be propelled to consider new marketing arrangements, new forms of African and third world cooperation, and some devices to moderately restrain foreign exploitation. The agreement between oil producers has been the most striking in recent times. African governments have been understandably ambivalent in their attitudes toward the maneuvers of the North African oil states and other producers in the Middle East. But the fact that so many members of the OAU broke diplomatic relations with Israel was no insignificant achievement in the face of Zionist imperialist propaganda and penetration in Africa. Excuse me. Clearly, the system of neocolonialism is not closed to elementary progressive steps by the present leadership. Strictly speaking, such steps derive from the perceived class interests of the petty bourgeoisie. For this reason, it is crucial that within a Pan-African forum, a principled and analytical position should be advanced for the adoption of increasingly revolutionary strategies for African economic and political liberation. The petty bourgeoisie must either be pushed forward or further exposed. As stated at the outset, popular struggle is carried on in many ways and at many different levels. The struggle to participate is the opening round of the series of interconnected battles likely to emerge out of the proposed Sixth Pan-African Congress. Queries have been raised with the temporary secretariat of the Congress concerning fears that anti-government organizations in the Caribbean would be excluded from participation, owing to the involvement of at least 2 English-speaking Caribbean governments in financing and in offering venues for preparatory meetings. In an open letter to the Secretary of the Temporary Secretary, Owusu Sadaki drew attention to the following points. The involvement of heads of states who use their relationship to the Sixth Pan-African Congress as a sign of being progressive, while in fact they pursue domestic and foreign policies which maintain the neocolonial status quo within their own countries. And 2, the possibility that because of financial problems and other problems, the only people representing Caribbean countries will be official government delegations and not those people who represent community workers and other progressive groups in the areas.
It is useful to quote at some length from the reply by the Secretary, Cortland Cox. He noted that, quote, the Tanganyika African National Union, which is host for the Sixth Pan-African Congress, strongly recommended that all African and Caribbean heads of state, without exception, be invited to the Congress. This formal procedure should not be construed as a blanket endorsement by the Congress of domestic and foreign policies of all heads of state, nor should it be taken that the Congress will be dominated by the policies of any one or group of these heads of state. The truth is that those who advocate the most militant steps for African liberation frequently don't have even the money to get together to talk. President Nyerere used the occasion for of an interview with the Congress earlier this year to ask how can the colonial created existing Black states be used by our people to gain liberation. These states are there. Their policies, institutions, and services have some considerable impact on the lives of millions of Africans. Our criteria for delegations to the Sixth Pan-African Congress may be stated generally as 1, Africans with demonstrated commitment to progressive political principles, 2, Africans with capabilities or access to these necessary to meet our people's basic needs, especially those with technical skills, and 3, Africans with mass political bases, as embodied in political organizations and institutions with recognized community constituencies. No delegates, whether from the Caribbean or anywhere else, will be prevented from participating in the Congress due to lack of funds. This is one of the special charges of the International Secretariat and the International Steering Committee. In spite of the above reassurances, it will undoubtedly require vigilance, mobilization, and perhaps confrontation within the Caribbean on the part of left movements to confirm their right to attend, albeit alongside of representatives of governments and pro-government organizations. The apparent restriction of delegations to the English-speaking Caribbean is another negative feature. The seemingly superficial difference of language has always sharply divided the international Black movement into an Anglophone sector and a Latin culture zone. French-speaking and Spanish-speaking Blacks joined their brothers in French rural Africa in elaborating the initially anti-colonialist and anti-racist doctrine of negritude. But like Pan-Africanism, negritude in the hands of petty bourgeois Black states became a sterile formulation of Black chauvinism and capable of challenging capitalism and imperialism. Negritude in Senegal buttresses neocolonialism, while in Haiti it is used to gloss over an even more desperate situation of exploitation and suppression of the Black masses.
Sorry, I was thinking about that. It is important to break through the language barrier, and it is crucial to recognize the existence of opposed tendencies within the international Black world. The Congress organizers must be asked to take steps to reach the known nationalist and socialist opponents of French colonial rule in places like Martinique and French Guiana. And they cannot be allowed to sidestep the existence of a large Black population in Cuba who have already accumulated rich experience in the liquidation of racism through socialist transformation. But of course, these are not tasks left to be done solely. These are not tasks left to be solely to the Secretariat of the host country of Tanzania. Any Pan-Africanist committed to socialist revolution will first strive to ensure that the Congress and the future of Pan-Africanism are not left to the tender mercies of the Black petty bourgeoisie. It is still not clear which governments will or will not participate in the proposed Sixth Pan-African Congress. No release from the temporary secretariat has borne on this point. Although information did become public via the Tanzanian press, suggesting that the invitations were all embracing and that a proposal to exclude Banda was defeated. The more conservative African governments may well view the whole idea with skepticism, if not hostility. For them, the OAU is quite enough for the realization of Pan-Africanism.
Eloquent testimony to the doubts on the parts of segments of the petty bourgeoisie was provided by an editorial comment in Kenya's Sunday Nation of March 17, 1974. It suggested that many people would query the very calling of another Pan-African Congress on the grounds that, quote, most of the aims of the Pan-African movement were achieved after the 1945 Manchester meeting, end quote. Besides, the proposed Sixth Pan-African Congress has certain areas of focus such as health, agriculture, technological research, liberation support, and political cooperation. And according to the commentary in question, it might be better to leave the governments and the OAU to organize such programs. Even granting the need for another Congress, the Sunday Nation, representative of local and foreign capitalist interests in Kenya, find that, quote, the whole political tenor of the proposed Congress is leftist, and the choice of Dar es Salaam as the venue for the meeting is no accident, end quote. The commentary is in no doubt that the most critical question is that of whom to invite, and it reacts strongly and specifically to the mere whisper that Cuba might be invited. Asking rhetorically, quote, how can the government of Cuba be invited as a participating government, end quote. One must certainly thank this right-wing African journal for corroborating an analysis made from a different perspective. The one point on which class enemies can agree is that there is a battle to be fought. Given the balance of forces in the African continent today at the level of state power, it must be assumed that apart from the liberation movements, the majority of African delegates will seek to retain Pan-Africanism within its present parameters of interstate cooperation based on the persistence of the territorial units and of petty bourgeois control. However, a progressive presence of one dimension or another would at least ensure that certain issues would be open to debate. The issues most likely to evoke contention can particularly be foreseen by scrutinizing the official document referred to as the call, both in terms of what it says and perhaps more indicative what it does not say.
The call accords high priority to the question of liberation in the still colonized parts of Africa. This is as it should be, not merely because one wants the South to be independent like the rest of Africa, but more so because the nature of the confrontation in South Africa offers the real possibility of African freedom, there being qualitatively different from that which was obtained by the constitutional road. Since Southern Africa is the cockpit of international monopoly capital, and since Portugal and the white minority regimes are all clearly supported by NATO and multinational corporations, the struggle for national liberation is a rather clearer learning experience than the nationalist episode of the 1950s. People are fighting and dying for more than the trappings of independence. In each theater of operations, both the leadership and the masses are maturing so that members of the petty bourgeois stratum, which exists there as everywhere else, have either failed to last the tough course, or they have been transformed in the process. There will no doubt be more instances of opportunism and defections, and there will no doubt be a much longer period of the practice of tribalist mobilizations in certain quarters. But the prospects of greater ideological clarity or increasing politicization and of a stronger attachment to equalitarian and democratic structures arise directly out of the concrete situation, being preconditions for the success of armed struggle. At the very least, the Congress would be expected to record the firmest statement of support for the liberation movements, taking as a point of departure the accord reached recently by the OAU at Accra, which has been the most resolute statement by African leaders to date. Documentary support for this liberation movement is by no means a decisive factor in their existence or success, but when a conference has to pronounce on this matter, then those statements must be sharp enough to constitute political and diplomatic weapons for the use in the rear of those fighting on the front lines. Because the Lukasa Manifesto was a mild document, which could be interpreted as having some reservations about armed struggle, it was seized upon in this sense by many reactionaries, and it was still being quoted as an official position of progressive African leaders long after they had unequivocally declared their backings for the armed struggle of the Mogadishu Declaration.
However, generally speaking, no delegate at any conference today has to make the case for the liberation movements. For one thing, they are already making the most effective case for themselves through sacrifice and achievements. And for another thing, the real danger in the support of the movement on the African continent itself is that rhetoric may take the place of practical assistance. The record today exposes the gap between resolution and practice on the part of OAU members as far as monetary support to the OAU Liberation Committee is concerned. Recently, the rhetoric has become seemingly more fiery and reveals a tendency to obfuscate issues concerning the interpretation of the struggle. Take, for instance, the demagogic appeal that African governments should send army to the combat zone. Such a suggestion is completely out of touch with the concept of people's war and out of sympathy with the process through which people prepare themselves for self-liberation. One African generalissimo has just called for the scrapping of people's guerrilla activities in Southern Africa and proposes instead to lead his own mercenary army to conquer the white regimes. Even the slightly more palatable call for individual volunteers cast doubt on the capacity of Africans in the South to effect their own liberation. Significantly enough, these statements do not originate with any of the liberation movements. None of the liberation movements have called for anything other than material, diplomatic, and moral support. They have the fighters. That is not the problem. A serious problem does arise when offers of assistance to the struggle are used to camouflage attempts to penetrate and control on the part of imperialism and its lackeys. When our man in Kinshasa appears in the role of supervisor, umpire, and builder of the Angolan People's Movement, it hardly requires a great deal of political acumen to sense the pricking of one's thumb.
The Congress must be asked to adopt the position that liberation movements should at all times be allowed to speak for themselves. The demand should be that both inside and outside Africa, liberation movements should have unshakable credentials, instead of being excluded when their interests are being discussed, or instead of having to fight anew on each occasion to determine whether they should have the status of observers or second-class participants. It is for the movements to indicate their own priorities and necessities at the Congress, and in response, other delegates would contemplate that practical support which can be mobilized. It should also be made clear that the most positive support is the advancement of popular anti-imperialist power everywhere on the continent and in the Pan-African world. Vying with liberation is important in importance in the estimation of the authors of the call is the question of science and technology. The call rightly asserts that if we do not control the means of survival and protection in the context of the 20th century, we will continue to be colonized. Consequently, it proposes the establishment of a Pan-African Center of Science and Technology geared towards such priorities as the development of viable self-supporting agricultural systems in Africa. On the issue of technology, one is again faced with the fact that superficially universal agreement can be obtained. No one would deny the necessity for mobilizing maximum resources in science and technology to fight the war against ignorance, disease, and poverty. No one can remain indifferent to the chronic malnutrition or to the acute suffering brought on by widespread drought and famine. The danger is that a discussion of technology tends to become technocratic in the worst sense of the word. Drought and famine, for instance, are not merely natural phenomena arising out of the failure of precipitation from on high. The incapacity to prevent or deal with drought and famine and the fantastic hardship which ensues are all related to the socioeconomic structures of neocolonial Africa and to the way that our enemies are located within the international imperialist system. It requires certain political decisions to change these structures and the system. Whether or not Africa will make scientific progress, whether or not the technology will be relevant and adequate, whether or not the mass of the people will benefit from scientific or technological innovations are all questions which can be resolved only within specific socioeconomic contexts, and questions which are therefore ultimately political and ideological.
It is precisely in the political, ideological sphere that the call is most deficient. It confines itself to the broad distinction between colonized Blacks and European colonizers. It says nothing about the existence of capitalist and socialist systems or of struggle within the capitalist imperialist world. It comes out against the fact that Africans allow finance capital to dominate and direct their economic and social life, but this leaves room for the national bourgeois interpretation that this domination can be remedied while still remaining within the capitalist fold. Indeed, most African governments are at the most scrambling to become more deeply involved in the European common market. With regard to indigenous exploitation, the authors of the call are prepared to, quote, stand with those who are avowed and open enemies of the elite who wish to lead a life of privilege among our people, end quote. Which is fine, but hardly sufficient analytical and but hardly sufficiently analytical and explicit. In defense of the bland nature of the call, the organizers of the conference would no doubt argue that it is not their function to preempt discussion, but that their role is to bring together a wide spectrum of views held by concerned Africans and Black people everywhere, in line with Cox to Sadaki, as cited above. Sadaki. But the tenor of the discussion so far has been to illustrate that neutrality and unity of nationalism is illusory, and that in practice, particular classes or strata capture nationalist movements and chart their ideological and political direction. Pan-Africanism today has to recognize such situations if it is to be a brand of revolutionary nationalism and if it is to be a progressive internationalist force. Coincidentally, a conference of Asians is scheduled to be held in Tokyo next June at about the same time as the 6th Pan-African Congress. Their preparatory committee has also circulated a preliminary call which suggests that, quote, we have been left behind and they are ahead of us, end quote. However, in this instance, we and they are not simplistically Asians and Europeans, respectively. On the contrary, the Asian Preparatory Committee explains as follows, quote, we are the people, the masters of the people. They are those who have power and money. They create their own network of power and money to exploit and suppress us, the people. We, the people, are left behind. We are divided and ruled, end quote.
The inference to be drawn from the above Asian analogy is that the goal of the African people's unity is by no means inconsistent with a policy, drawing a line of steel against African enemies of the people, and with seeking the closest working relations with non-African peoples to the extent that the latter are engaged in the fight against exploitation. It should not be imagined that previous Congresses were occasions for all Black camaraderie. Oftentimes, the left and the right were represented, and a line had to be hammered out through struggle, as was the case when Du Bois and Blaise, I forget how to pronounce his last name.
Gianni.
Yeah, I can confronted each other. For that matter, the reactionary trend was occasionally successful, notably when the French colonialists managed to promote their own spokesperson, Blaise. Where's my mouse? Sorry. Whatever may emerge from the Whatever may emerge from the 6th Pan-African Congress, it is necessary that some participants should be identified with the platform which recognizes the following elements. 1, that the principal enemies of the African people are the capitalists in the USA, Western Europe, and Japan. 2, that African liberation and unity will be realized only through struggle against the African allies of international capital. 3, that African freedom and development requires disengagement from international monopoly capital. 4, that exploitation of Africans can be terminated only through the construction of a socialist society, and technology must be related to this goal. 5, that contemporary African state boundaries must be removed to make way for genuine political economic unity of the continent. 6, that the liberation of movements of Southern Africa are revolutionary and anti-imperialist and must therefore be defended against petty bourgeois state hegemony. 7, that the unity of Africa requires the unity of progressive groups, organizations, and institutions rather than merely being the preserve of states. And 8, that Pan-Africanism must be an internationalist, anti-imperialist, and socialist weapon. Signed, Walter Rodney in Dar es Salaam, April 1974.
Woo! So shout out to the 75 people that stuck with us.
I know.
Bye, Rouse. Brow said, I also have a meeting and report back soon, but want to say I can listen to y'all and Jackie cuss all day. That's funny. All right. Bye, y'all. Yo, boo left too, Layla. So anyway, so I think that was a wonderful, wonderful compliment to the conversation that we had with Kehinde and Walter Rodney. Listen, if you did not know about Walter Rodney before, this should convince you of the erudition, precision, analytical prowess of this man. That was fucking excellent. And he's so fair, right? Like, and he's funny. He got jokes too, but like he's critical, but there's not shade, right? And it's not self-serving. Like he really, I think, is given you might feel there was shade towards the crew, but like he's giving like a balance, I think, an informed assessment of Pan-Africanism and how it gets hijacked by neocolonialism, and why class does matter. I'm asking.
I don't feel like it's shade. I mean, I don't have his same take on Kantianism. That's just a different thing. But other than that, no, I don't. But it was just making me think about so many different things. One, even in thinking about, what is the role of these conferences? And then thinking about like the number of conferences that I've been to like this over the years, and thinking about the sort of the practical problems that come about when you have to navigate across different linguistic barriers, but also just very clearly like what is it that the goal is? What is the goal of the conference? Who is the character? But another thing that it was really making me think about too was, there's always this conversation about, we're trying to build a mass party. It needs to be a mass movement. There's the problem of the sort of petty bourgeois at the level of the nation state. And, even though like, a figure like Chavez, right, did not come from the petty bourgeois ranks, right, but obviously sort of ascended to be such, at a certain point. And it really is making me ask, like, I'm really curious about the question about, have we ever really had a moment where there's really been mass support? Not because the people say that about the civil rights movement, but that wasn't necessarily true. People say that about the Black Party, that wasn't necessarily true. And so I'm just, as much as I do think it is a necessary goal to have a mass character and mass components, I'm also just wondering about the constant sort of critique of the lack of the mass character. And this is not about Walter Rodney, because I don't think that he was saying that. I think that his argument is that we need to continue to push to have mass character. But then when other people, I think, sometimes disingenuously make this argument that, oh, these movements are not mass. And I'm just wondering, at what point have we actually had mass movements? And mass movements require a major shift in sort of the ideology of the people, which requires mass education. And so to the level that did not exist in much of the African continent in terms of like mass popular education. To this day, education on the African continent is still very much monopolized by private entities, the Catholic Church, like all these other kinds of things. And so when we're also thinking about what it means to build the mass character of the movement, like, are we actually thinking about the sort of structures that are necessary to do so? Because even in the United States, like even as much as education has expanded to some degrees, we still like largely, like less than 40% of the population has had access to, higher education. And then even in terms of, what do you call it? K through 12 schooling, like what the nature of that is, and obviously the political agendas that are pushed through that. So I'm just really thinking about this question of like mass character and how do we really get there?
Cults.
Oh my God.
Seriously, there be tens of thousands of people in these cults. They don't need to read, they just need to believe and follow the leader.
But even the believing in shit, that typically comes through being able to provide the masses of people with something. Because like, that's kind of what
something ain't literacy in a cult is all I'm saying. But yeah, so I was thinking about like the Zapatistas. Maybe that was mass character. I don't know, but I think that perhaps this is the because they fail to take on a mass character at some point is why they don't have longevity, and why they ultimately get captured by imperialism and colonialism, etc. Right?
Which is why Cuba has lasted for a long time, because it did actually have a mass education campaign. So
mass education, and yeah, so. This is to me the question about like vanguardism or not, right? Is there, do you need a vanguard party, or like, does a vanguard party work? And it's like, well, in some cases, yes, but it has to become mass and character at some point. The point of like cadre, the point of a vanguard party is to build, is to bring the masses to consciousness, as it were. I don't know. It's just so hard in the but then I look at the right wing. Their shit is mass and character. They have violence, weapons.
It is, and they're not particularly literate either.
That's what I'm saying. But they have their symbols. They have a very easy messaging. But
so you say their cult, they got their cult shit going, right?
They do, but they also have everything on their side, like everything set up against the left here, not the right. And so, but they should be much more mass in character than like in the context of the United States than like other places.
And I mean, to some degree, they have been, right. This is why we have Donald Trump now. But also, like they lose, you know, all their poor whites are recognizing, like, oh, your ass was getting free lunch too, and what are you like? All these farmers in Nebraska losing their shit. These entire towns, like these white towns, full of folks who are benefiting from free and reduced lunch programs for schools. Kids can't go to school, so. But they really have bought into a hook, line, and sinker. So I know you are both serious and joking, but I guess the cult shit really, it is a cult. White supremacy is a psychosis. It's a cult. It's
because you like, you know, because cults just play into a particular need or want in a simple way that allows people to suspend, what is it? To suspend reason, or what is it? Yeah. So I don't know, but it's, you know. Yeah, I'll be interested to see how active we get in the coming months, because it really does there is really a stark contrast between, like I said, that 2017 moment and what's happening now.
Yeah, I do know. I agree with your assessment of that. I do feel like people seemed to be more willing and or ready to do some shit prior, and now it really does feel like people are just like, what are we gonna do?
Right. And it's funny because usually, like, when your material conditions are threatened, that incites you to action, but now it's kind of like people are just like, well, I'm not gonna have this anymore, so why fight for it, you know?
Yeah. And I can't even lie, to some in some aspects of that, I have felt that way. It's like, okay, I'm gonna leave. Like, I mean, when I say leave, I don't mean leave, but like, I'm gonna leave this little job here. I'm gonna go home and do it. But that doesn't mean my plan is to do nothing. But there are certain elements of it that I'm just willing to let go of.
Right. All right, y'all. Well, on that positive note, on that jolly note, thanks for staying with us this long. I know that was a long read, but hopefully you all got something out of it and you'll go back and reread it. I think it's a great political education document, other than the fact that it's very long. Maybe you can read it in parts. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it is very clear and pointed, and specifically in his ability to think about this going into the conference. Like, as we go here, these are the things that we should be trying to do, as opposed to you know, just letting whatever the chips fall where they may as a result of the conference. Those are yeah.
He's such a principled and responsible person, man. Love that guy. All right, y'all. Until 2 weeks from now, we'll see you then.
Maybe with a woman.
Bye, y'all.
Peace.
That's all.